Madam Chair, it's Justin Dave, the clerk of the committee, and I understand that you can start the meeting. You're ready to go.
I call this meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. We are welcome to meeting number 10 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, April 11th, the committee is meeting to discuss the parliamentary duties in the context of COVID-19, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we start, I want to inform members that pursuant to this order of reference, the committee is meeting for two reasons. Number one, for the purpose of undertaking a study and receiving evidence concerning matters related to the conduct of parliamentary duties in the context of COVID-19, and two, to prepare and present a report to the House of Commons by May 15th. The order of reference also stipulates that only motions needed to determine witnesses and motions related to the adoption of the report are in order. Today's meeting is taking place via video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware that the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. In order to facilitate the work of our interpreters and ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Interpretation of this video conference will work very much like in a regular meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. So please, at this time, if you haven't already done so, look at the bottom of the screen on your Zoom application and pick the language of preference. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can either click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, or you can hold down the space bar while you are speaking. When you release the bar, your mic will unmute just like a walkie-talkie. This is a great option for quick interactions. However, I do recommend that if you are going to be not speaking for a long period of time, that you go on to the standard mute setting. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Should members need to request the floor outside of the designated time for questions, they should activate their mic and state that they have a point of order. If a member wishes to intervene on a point of order that has been raised by another member, they should use the raised hand function. This will signal to the chair that you are interested in speaking. In order to do so, you should click on participants at the bottom of your screen. When the list pops up, you will see next to your name that you can click raise hand. Some may have this at the bottom of their participant list. So it will either be on the side of your name or at the bottom of your list. Raise your hand and you will be able to see beside your name that your hand has been raised. And my list will go according to priority, so this will work, I think, quite well. I'll be able to, even if I don't see it in live time, I'll be able to see who raised their hand first. When speaking, speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, your mic should always be on mute. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged. It does amplify the voice and make it much more clear and crisp. And if you do have disturbances from wherever you are, it will be less likely to catch the surrounding sounds. Should any technical challenges arise, for example, in relation to interpretation, or if you are accidentally disconnected, please advise the chair immediately, and the technical team will work to resolve the problem. Please note that we may need to suspend during these times as we need to ensure that all members are able to participate fully. Before we get started, can everyone click on their screen in the top right-hand corner and ensure that they are on gallery view? With this view, you should be able to see all the participants in a grid view. It will ensure that all video participants can see one another. This is the only view that gives us the most realistic feeling of being in a committee room as well. During this meeting, we will follow the same rules that usually apply to opening statements and the questioning of witnesses during our regular meetings. Each witness will have 10 minutes for an opening statement, followed by the usual rounds of questions from members. And I'd like to thank our witnesses today for providing their opening statements in advance. Just as we usually would in a regular committee meeting, we will suspend in between panels in order to allow the first group of witnesses to depart and for the next panel to join the meeting. I would now like to welcome our
Madam Chair,
witnesses.
Madam
Yes.
Chair, just as a point of order, my understanding is as of now that this is only being broadcast as audio when the meeting notice indicated that it was to be a video conference. So I'm just trying to confirm whether in fact the video is working on the Parleview site, which is where I presume this is being broadcast from. So if anybody can confirm that, please.
Thank you for raising that question. I'll find out. Thank you for raising that question. I believe there was just a minor delay in technical difficulty, so I have been informed that it has been fixed. Thank you for raising that. So now, to begin, I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We'll start with the Speaker Anthony Rota. Welcome to meeting number 10 of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. We're looking forward to hearing from you on this study.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here this morning, and I want to say good morning to all the members of the committee, and thank you for the invitation. Bonjour tout le monde, c'est un plaisir d'être ici.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mandate further to the motion adopted by the House on April 11th. Specifically, you have been asked to study ways in which members can fulfill their parliamentary duties while the House stands adjourned on account of public health concerns caused by COVID-19 pandemic, including the temporary modification of certain procedures, sittings in alternate locations, and technological solutions, including a virtual parliament. La Chambre des communes est...
The House of Commons and its members play an essential role both in advancing legislation and in holding the government accountable. Recognizing the importance of these roles that are the cornerstone of our democracy, collaboration amongst members and parties has enabled parliamentarians to perform these duties on behalf of Canadians during this pandemic. Indeed, since the House adjourned on March 13 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been recalled twice and sat again yesterday to deal with some of the effects of this unprecedented situation. The House of Commons has also authorized certain standing committees to hold virtual meetings to ensure that Canadians receive the information they need and that the executive remains accountable for its actions.
The devastating consequences on the livelihood and personal lives of Canadians, members are being called upon to play a role while adapting to the current context and finding new ways to fulfill their parliamentary duties. Several standing committees have held public meetings by teleconference or video conference, and the House has met a few times with the reduced number of members in attendance, observing public health guidelines for social distancing and avoiding unnecessary travel. While this approach has worked to advance support to Canadians and granted the government the necessary authority and powers to respond to the pandemic, it does present considerable challenges to all members to fully participate in the proper exercise of their representative role. As Speaker and as member, I am keenly aware of the impacts of this pandemic is having on individual members and how it's affecting our ability to perform our duties as we would wish. Not surprisingly, others have had the same concerns, and so you have been given the mandate to study the possibility of virtual sitting of the House of Commons and even of sitting in alternate locations. The creation yesterday of a special committee on COVID-19 pandemic will provide another mechanism to ensure that parliamentary oversight is maintained. Si je fais ainsi la liste des avenues que nous explorons actuellement, c'est par...
Well, this approach, as speaker and member, we must recognize that a sitting that includes a remote participation member or that is entirely virtual cannot entirely reproduce either in its practice or its tradition that Canadians are accustomed to when they watch the proceedings of the House. It would be impossible to respect all the traditions that Canadians are accustomed to seeing when they watch the proceedings of the House. To this end, as you consider various options for sittings of the House that would be adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic, I would suggest that you bear in mind the following guiding principles in addition to any that your committee might identify. 1.
Must uphold the rights, immunities, and privileges of the House and its members. 2. Simultaneous interpretation both in French and English must be available to members. Members should also continue to have access to established processes for the interpretation of Indigenous languages. 3. All members must be able to participate, recognizing that connectivity can vary in constituencies. Because of the range of services available in different regions and of varying security requirements and capabilities, it will be important for each member to take the time to work with the House administration to ensure the best possible outcome. 4. Any changes to the House's rules and practices should be made in a manner that ensure that legal validity of the proceedings continues. The clerk and law clerk will be your next witnesses and are prepared to advise the committee, amongst other things, on the interpretation of Section 48 of the Constitution Act of 1867, which deals with quorum. 5. The solution which should limit the changes to the rules and practices of our House to what is temporarily required for its implementation must be considered. Our rules and practices would undoubtedly need some adjustment. For example, it will not be practical for a member participating remotely to rise in their place to be recognized to speak. Other long-standing practices that uphold the dignity of the House, for example, addressing remarks through the chair, insisting the proceedings be conducted in a respectful manner, and maintaining the rule that members wishing to speak wear business attire, can and should continue to inform how the House conducts its business, even though it's by virtual means. Now, I have watched a few recent video conferences, including the one this morning, and we could not help but notice that some members were just, let's say, bending the dress code a little bit. Number 6, the video of the proceedings of the House should be accessible, include French and English closed captioning, be available live and on demand through Parleview, and continue to be disseminated to media organizations for the broadcast and to CPAC for distribution to viewers across Canada. Outre ces grands principes directeurs,
with these guiding principles in mind, this committee may wish to consider some additional factors that might help ensure the success of any proposal allowing for virtual sitting of the House during the pandemic. Initially, I wish to recognize the work of the employees of the House administration for achieving so much in such a short time. The recent virtual and teleconference committee meetings that they made possible were an undertaking of a different order of magnitude from their daily responsibilities. Despite the considerable challenges posed by physical distancing and various other concerns and anxieties, they worked hard so that these critical committee meetings could take place swiftly and effectively.
While the House administration and its administration are operating without a full workforce, they are committed to providing all necessary on-site operational support needed for the House, its committees, and members in a way that secures the health and safety of all those employees whose dedication make our parliamentary work possible. I believe it is important that we as members recognize this is a reality and acknowledge that not everything is possible during this pandemic. I say this as a list of standing committee authorized to committee to meet. I say this even as the list of standing committee authorized to meet increases. The capacity of administration and its partnership and its partners is finite. These committees will not be able to meet all at the same time if a virtual sitting of the House is also taking place. It will be necessary to establish priorities. Accordingly, I have instructed the administration to provide the whips with a weekly schedule founded on current capacity constraints so that they can divide what they wish guidelines and testing, as well as assistance before, during, and after their interventions, if any virtual proceedings. I will ask that you continue to make yourself available, be patient, and allow time to resolve difficulties that will occur as natural part of this innovation of virtual settings. Further, during our deliberations, I would refer you to my response of April 8th to a letter from the government House leader I received on April 5th, receiving advice with respect to virtual sitting of House of Commons. As I stated in my reply, I asked the administration to propose an approach that would allow for virtual sittings of the House within 4 weeks. This ongoing work for the administration involves experts from digital services, real property, and from procedural services working in partnership with our public and private sector partners, with the goal of enabling the House to hold virtual sittings. The administration continues to consult other parliaments to learn from their technological changes that they are making during this pandemic, as well as national and international security partners and experts in virtual collaboration. Pendant que vous évaluerez les différentes
As you weigh the benefits and risks of the various options to be explored, ranging from sittings held in alternate locations to hybrid or entirely virtual sittings, we as members must make certain that any approach we implement allows the proceedings of the House to be carried out with the integrity and dignity that all members and all Canadians expect of our Parliament. We also have a responsibility with respect to order and decorum.
And following sittings of the House, I can only imagine the challenges and delays that sitting outside of our nation's capital would bring as we wait to resume our parliamentary duties. L'avenue des séances entièrement virtuelles continuerait-elle aussi un changement de cap radical qui...
Entirely virtual sittings also represent a significant change, one that would multiply the practical, procedural, or technical challenges to be overcome. To support any sittings in a manner that meets the existing accessibility requirements, we should continue to leverage the same physical spaces, technology infrastructure, and human resources used to support physical meetings on Parliament Hill.
Committee meetings offers a prime example of the benefits of an incremental approach to delivering new solutions in support of parliamentary work. Taking a similar approach to virtual house sitting will allow the administration to offer the best possible service to every member, ensuring that each is able to make full, informed, and effective use of remote participation tools and processes. The largest challenge facing members is that a majority of the 338 members are now in separate locations, far away from each other. An incremental approach should therefore consider the proceedings that better lend themselves to this reality. For example, as it has been suggested, member statements and ministerial statements. Based on that experience, the House could then gradually expand the type of proceedings covered in a virtual sitting to more closely resemble a typical sitting of the House, so as to effectively engage the full participation of members. This could, in time, extend as far as remote voting through a secure technology, should circumstances require it and the House approve it. An early indication that you can provide to the House administration as to particular options that you feel best responds to the needs of the House will help prioritize the issues at hand. To assist the committee, representatives from the House administration, in collaboration with our partners, stand ready to provide support and advice on how to meet your requirements. In summary, Madam Chair, we want to proceed as quickly as we can, keeping in mind the principles and other considerations I have mentioned, which I hope your committee will take into account. The earlier that you can provide direction as to the options you would like to pursue, the quicker and the more efficient our staff will be able to provide a solution for the benefit of all members and the Canadians that we serve. With that, the clerk and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you would have. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Madam Chair.
Yes, I was actually just going to say I saw the hands raised, Mr. Brassard and Ms. May. Before we go on to the questioning, could I hear from you?
Thank you. And it's just a point of a technical question. I'm generally proficient in both languages. I understand English and French. I just find that with the interpretation, the level of volume on the interpretation is actually equal to the level of volume of the speaker, and a lot of the words it's difficult to follow. So I'm just wondering if there's one way that we can raise the volume of the interpreter or lower the volume of the interpreter so that it doesn't all mix together. I don't know if anybody else is hearing what I'm hearing, but
yes.
It's just a technical thing.
Mr. Brassard, we are hearing it. I have mentioned it to the clerk, and I believe a few other members have left me messages about that. So thank you for bringing that up because, yes, it does make it difficult to hear either or. So it makes it difficult, I think, for everyone, no matter how many languages you know. Thank you for that. And we're going to look into why, if that could be adjusted. Ms. May, you had something to say?
Yeah, only, Madam Chair, to request that if time allows, I be allowed a question on the round with the speaker. Thank you. Not being a full member of the committee, I'm taking my place virtually at the table, and I await at your discretion. I'd like to ask a question.
Thank you. I'll try to see if any of the parties are willing to give up a time slot or how we can adjust you in. We'll try to take care of that. Thank you, Ms. May. Okay, now that has been brought to the attention of the technical team, I think we should continue with our question rounds. Our first round is the 6-minute round, and that is beginning with MP Blake Richards.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but were we not to, I guess this is on a point of order, by the way, so it's not out of my time. Would we not hear from the clerk with opening remarks or prior?
The clerk will be giving his statement at the beginning of the second round. So this round, the clerk is there for any questions you may have, but the statement will be given to us at the beginning of the second round.
Well, for clarification.
Second panel, sorry.
Sure. For clarification, we are able to, we have at the table both the clerk and the speaker, and we can question both, but the opening remarks by the clerk will be given before the second half of the meeting.
Correct.
Okay, just clarify.
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start, Mr. Speaker. In your opening remarks, you had laid out three what you called guiding principles that you thought were important for the committee to consider. And I would agree they are all important considerations. Essentially, in short form, that we make sure that any model that we would come up with would uphold the rights, immunities, and privileges of the House and its members, that interpretation in both English and French would be available, and that all members would be able to participate. And you point out in there that recognizing that connectivity can vary in different constituencies, and that certainly is true in our country, no question. So given that, you've given a directive that the administration try to put this together in 4 weeks. Can you give us a sense as to where that 4 weeks came from? What advice you received that would have indicated 4 weeks would be an appropriate amount of time for that to happen? And are you firmly of the belief, are you quite certain that these three principles can be in fact upheld if we were to move ahead with something in that amount of time or less?
I consulted with administration to see what they were capable of, and they were very, very strong. They have a good team in place, and they figured that the middle of May was feasible, and it is something that could work out very well. I mean, and I say could, all things being perfect, we'll have everything running smoothly. But as you can see in setting up this morning, there was some technicalities in there, making sure that everything runs smoothly. One of the big issues that is of concern, as you mentioned, is the fact that not all MPs or not all ridings are treated equally when it comes to internet connectivity. That is a concern to especially rural ridings where connectivity could be a problem. And that's where we start looking at, let me deal with the two easy ones first. Interpretation, that one is coming together and shouldn't be a problem, whether it's every member across the country should be able to have the proceedings transmitted in French or English, their choice, or if they want to on, sorry, is there a problem with the sound or?
No, just in the interest of time, I mean, I think you've given a pretty clear indication that you feel that one won't be an issue.
No, and I was just going to touch on rights and privilege. That is by not having the connectivity or having an issues, that could be an issue down the road. So that is something we're looking at. But I'll let you get on to the next question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So you are concerned about that possibility still. We want to make sure you sounds like there's maybe some doubt in your mind about whether that one might be become an issue.
It might be an issue, multifaceted. One, for the connectivity, as we've mentioned, in some areas they don't have the connectivity, and some of our MPs are not tech savvy, let's say, where they're not hooked up, and getting them on board might be a little bit more difficult. It's a small minority, but they have the same rights as everyone else, and that has to be respected.
Of course. And you mentioned, some of the difficulties we've had today, and there has been a few of those for sure. This is the second committee meeting that I participated in. Well, I guess a third actually, but the first one by video. The other two, finance and a previous meeting we had of this committee, video wasn't enabled yet. This is a pretty recent development with the committee aspect of things, and I wonder if you would share concerns based on what you've experienced today. And I know you've participated, I believe, in some Board of Internal Economy meetings, or at least one by teleconference. And I don't know if you can share with us your experience. I mean, obviously, I'm not asking you to tell us what was said in camera, but your experiences in terms of how the technology worked and how whether those meetings were able to flow well. And obviously, when you're talking about a smaller number like that, when we get into a house of 338, those problems would only magnify. So I'm just curious, if that has you giving some pause for thought on this. And maybe while you're at it, could you give us some sense as to whether you've got any more clarification from the administration as to how that they arrived at that 4-week that they've given you as advice that they feel they could produce this all within?
Yeah, overall, when we look at what's been going on now, first, all of us have been working from home or from another location. And many of my calls, my meetings have taken place over either video conferencing and or teleconferencing, and most of them overall have been going fairly well. You referred to one meeting of Board of Internal Economy, which when we did hook up, there were some definite problems there. And what ended up happening, we finally figured out what it was, and it was administration. Again, we have some very competent technical people who figured out what the problem was. There was one of the lines on the floor. So if you were listening it through the meeting through floor feed, then there was a problem. If you got it French or English only, then it was working fine. And that was a technical issue, and that's something that does pop up occasionally. It's been taken care of. Unfortunately, sometimes if you've got an urgent meeting to have in place, you really don't. You don't have any say over, or you don't have the time to fix it. So there was some concerns on that one. But overall, I have a lot of confidence in the staff here that they'll find out an issue. But like anything else, once you have one thing solved, there'll be something else, and that happens in live presentations as well.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker,
that's it for time here, and I've definitely given leeway for opening statements and for each question as well. I'll continue to give a little bit of leeway because I know there's challenges, a little bit here and there. So we have factored that in. Next person up is Ms. Pettipa Taylor.
Can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
Before that I begin my comments, I first of all want to take an opportunity to really thank
just a point of order, Madam Chair. That's better.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So before I begin, I would like to take an opportunity to thank the IT staff and the House administration for all of the work that they've done in order to provide us with the tools that we need in order to have this virtual meeting. They're working very hard, and I want to acknowledge their work. I also want to take a moment, if you'll indulge me, in order to provide my sincere condolences to our friends from Nova Scotia. They are really going through an unthinkable situation, and I want to express my profound sorrow and grief. And as Canadians, we are really all Nova Scotians right now, and we grieve with them during this really, really difficult time. So I just felt that I had to put that on record. As PROC committee members, we've been asked to study our parliamentary duties with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted our duties. A few things that I just want to state for the record, I guess, is that we certainly know that COVID-19 is a serious public health threat, and the situation is evolving daily when we look at the numbers. The risk varies between communities, but given the number of cases in Canada, we certainly recognize that the risk remains high for all of us. When it comes to transmission, we certainly do know that most transmission is done from person-to-person transmission, but it comes from droplets that are shared, if you will, and the droplets can be spread for about 2 meters. So when we talk about staying 6 feet apart, we know where that comes from. And we also know that this virus can survive surfaces from for different periods of time, up to 3 days, and it depends on conditions and other factors. We also know that this virus has an incubation period of either up to 1 to 14 days, during which time mild asymptomatic transmissions can occur. So the best way, and I think we all know this, that we can prevent COVID-19 is by number one, staying home, by keeping safe distance, by washing our hands repeatedly, by covering our mouth when we cough, and by limiting our travel. Public health experts and researchers continue to research the risks involved, and they are basing that research on the best available science and data that is available. Canada has been tackling COVID-19, but I think we have to recognize we're far from being out of the woods, and we absolutely have to keep our foot on the gas in order to combat this virus. And I think we all recognize that during this pandemic, we are really experimenting with different, technologies and different procedures in order to provide and to do our duties as parliamentarians. We've been asked as PROC members to look at temporary modifications while using technological solutions, including virtual parliaments, to allow all members an opportunity to fulfill their parliamentary functions. And I have to stress all members, not just the ones that live close to Ottawa or the nation's capital. So all that, my first question, I guess, is really directed to the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that you're the chair of the Board of Internal Economy, and I'm wondering if you could share with committee members and Canadians what restrictions have been put in place as it relates to COVID-19 and why those restrictions were put in place, and did all parties agree to those restrictions?
There's a list. There's no touring, no committee travel, no meetings in person or staying 6 feet apart. There's a whole list of different, I don't have the list. It's fairly straightforward. I think you summed it up very well. But one of the big things that is very important is that we be careful. I mean, you summed up what we have to do and how we have to prevent it. I'm just going to defer to the clerk, Mr. Richards. You were asking why the clerk was here. He'll have the list of, and then I'll come back again, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Chair, the Board of Internal Economy reiterated some of the prohibitions that they had instituted some time ago, dealing with access to the building is now closed to the public and there are no tours. Committee travel has been suspended, international travel as well, and access to the building, even for staff, is fairly limited. We want all of our people, as much as possible, to work remotely.
Thank you so much. And were all parties in agreement with these changes that were brought forward?
I guess I'm on again. Yes, they were.
Excellent. And also, could you provide us with any guidance that has been given to our Hill staff that works in Parliament Hill? Were they given any direction with respect to working on the Hill, or should they be working remotely from home?
Where possible, they should be working from home. We do have some essential services on the Hill and support to MPs and to the Hill. Like when we look at the security services, there's a certain number. It's been reduced, but it's still there and providing security to members on the Hill.
And one other quick question, if I may. When the House is sitting like it was yesterday, how many staff were required to be there as opposed to a non-sitting day like today?
I will defer to the clerk on that one again.
There's some technical staff that has to be there. There's some procedural staff that has to be there. There are some other support staff. We were in the neighborhood of the upper 50s in terms of personnel that were in place on the Hill to support the functions. One point that I may add to what the Speaker pointed to in terms of what the administration is doing, we have a crisis management team that meets 3 times a week. We also have an incident management team, and we also have a communications program where we provide information to keep staff up to date. Now it's down to about a weekly communication.
That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Next up, I just want a clarification from the bloc. Will it be Monsieur Terrien or will it be Madame Normandet?
C'est moi.
Me? I believe it's me, Mr. Terrien. Well, I'd like to greet everyone in the group to begin with. Thank you, Speaker, for what you said. Now, you're right. I'm not wearing a tie. I feel a little guilty. I didn't change. That's the way it is. Now, I'd like to know what kind of decorum actually will have to be followed. For instance, now I'm not wearing my tie. Are we going to leave it up to the good judgment of those who are participating? I promise you that the next time I will be wearing a tie. Will that be enough to satisfy the criteria? Answer, well, the criteria are different for committees and for the House, but that's something we'll have to decide. So you are the ones who are in charge of suggesting changes, and perhaps that's one of the changes that you're going to suggest. Or you might decide that that's not necessarily critical. So you can make suggestions. The House will decide. I'm the servant of the House, and it's the House that will decide. Thank you. Now I have a few quick, brief questions. First, on the dignity and respect inherent in the questions that are asked. Now, when you're in the House as Speaker, you really are the guardian of the respect for others. You oversee that. How is this going to be managed? How is the dignity and integrity and respect going to be managed virtually? Well, we do have the possibility to mute microphones. That's one way. And I think it will be similar to what will happen in the House. It won't be a perfect system, but we are going to have rules whereby the Speaker will be able to act accordingly. If someone is not showing respect for another, they will have to be cut off in some way. Several committees have started sitting virtually. You referred to that earlier. What are the main problems that have arisen? And what is being suggested to deal with those issues? The main issue is that we are limited in what we can do. We can do one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so if there are more committees that want to sit, if there are, for example, 6 wanting to sit, that's going to be an issue. We don't have the resources to deal with that. Normally, a certain number of people are required for committees. And even if it requires less people, in this case, we do need more resources to make sure that everything unfolds smoothly. You can see this morning things are going well, but it took a full hour before the committee started sitting. So this was on top of other work that had to be done. These kinds of sittings require many resources to make sure that the committees can sit. If we keep the same number of committees that have been sitting on the Hill rather, then it's going to be difficult. We need an army of people who know what they're doing from a technical standpoint so that things run smoothly. You also said that whips would be responsible for the calendars because there are also many committees. So 2 questions. Are you confident that whips will be able to come to an agreement on a calendar? And are we going to have to change the number of sittings for committees because there aren't a lot of time slots that are available? So that was 2 questions. I trust that the whips will be able to communicate with each other and find a solution. That's what they'll have to do. Technically, we are facing a problem, yes. Not only an issue of people and overtime, but also there's the issue of finding people who are capable of doing this. So we will be discussing this within the House administration and technical staff so that we can determine how many individuals are required to do this so that we have all the resources we need to cover all committees. Would you exclude the possibility of some committees not being able to sit every week, that they have to wait a week? Well, everything is up in the air, and I think you, as a committee, will be making recommendations. I am open to whatever the House wishes, and once that's been decided by the House, then the Speaker's office and House administration and staff will have to make sure it happens. It's not always easy. It's not always possible. Thank you. Next week, there will be a first virtual question period. What do you think the biggest challenge will be with that in the House so that we can have quality question periods, at least ensure a minimum of quality so that all Quebecers and Canadians are informed, fully informed about what's happening within that House sitting? Well, first of all, I just want to clarify, this is not a House sitting, it's a COVID-19 committee that will be meeting. And it is the committee that will decide on how this will take place. The purpose will be to provide information, collect and provide information so that they are aware of what is happening. And our goal is to ensure transparency. From what I have understood, the opposition parties want to make sure that Canadians know what is happening. So it's a quasi-parliamentary duty or function. We will have this committee, in fact, that will sit. So what is the biggest challenge then, do you think? It's going to be the technology. We need to make sure that all those who are involved can ask questions that they want to ask, but we also need to make sure that privileges are respected. We need to make sure that everyone is included. It is a committee and that therefore an extension of the House. As soon as we have virtual parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you,
Ms. Blaney.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's lovely to see you, even in this virtual reality. And I just want to totally support some of my colleagues and thank the amazing interpreters and all the IT people and the staff that are making this happen. You know, when we've got to check in a little bit early just to get things done, I just want to express my deep appreciation for their adaptation to this very changing world that we're all experiencing. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the questions that I would like to ask you through the chair is, you talked earlier about your response to the government House leader, talking about what a virtual parliament and a timeline could look like. And it talks in there about you setting up a bit of a group. So I'm just wondering if you could tell me sort of what roles are in that group from what departments and how they're reporting back to the speaker and what access do the rest of parliamentarians have to that information. Thank you.
Basically, I've left it with the clerk to, and I've discussed it with the administration to see what we're capable of. And again, leaving it with mainly the IT department and checking into what can be done. And it's very favorable on that end, looking at it, saying, okay, 4 weeks was a reasonable amount of time to come up with a solution. Is it going to be perfect? As I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure, and neither is the administration, but we can have something that will be functional. One of the areas as far as the clerk and administration goes is the standing orders and how we continue to respect the individual member's privilege and rights under the Section 48 and the standing orders. We want to make sure that what exactly is implied or what is expected for a quorum, what is expected for the rules. Now, one of the things that has come up and is going to be a challenge is that in order to make changes and have standing orders be rearranged or done differently, we have to have everyone present at one time, or whoever wants to be in Parliament. And that's something that I'm not sure how to deal with at this point, and we are exploring the possibilities. But when you look at parliamentary privilege, it is the individuals having the right to at least vote or take part in discussions that are going on in Parliament to change the existing standing orders. We can't just arbitrarily say, well, we're going to make those changes and that's all there is to it. We have certain procedures that we have to follow, and that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. And everything's been opened as far as information that we have. There's nothing that is being kept. It's open to members upon their request, or a lot of it has been put out there as well.
Thank you. And I think, standing orders and modifications that would be required is a very important conversation. When we look at the fact that today that, when we called in for this committee with nowhere near 338 members of parliament, plus all of the folks attached, we were on the call half an hour. So I guess one of my questions are, what considerations are happening around parliamentary privilege? How are we addressing that through understanding that different ridings have different levels of connectivity? Is there a plan to look at people's members' homes and their offices? I'm just wondering in terms of that. And the other part is looking at ways to address issues. Like I'm thinking a few weeks ago, we had a massive power outage and in our area for 4 hours. And that meant that there was a lot of things that I couldn't do. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to parliamentary privilege, has there been any discussion about the connectivity aspect? How did that address that? And also sort of these acts that happen that we have no control over, and how will those be managed?
As far as connectivity goes, that is one of the major discussions that is taking place when we're looking at a virtual sitting. And administration as well as MPs are concerned about that, because I mean, connectivity, especially if you're from a rural riding, really affect how much participation you might have as a member of parliament in participating. So that is one of the key ones. As far as individual members go, what we've been doing, or what the administration has been doing, is spending time with each member. I notice you've got a headset. I don't know if that was sent to you or whether you had it yourself.
I come from one of those rural ridings. We have these.
Okay,
We're
good.
ready. We're ready.
But what happened with a lot of members, administration has sat down with them and gone through it, check their equipment, make sure everything's working, and make sure that everything goes smoothly when these meetings take place. So this is something that is being considered very closely and is being considered very seriously. As far as the power outage, I'm not sure what to tell you on that one. That's something that's very local, but it is very much an issue. One of the other issues that's come up and is the staff have been checking in with members, making sure that everything runs smoothly. And then lo and behold, they can't make it to their place of where they have their equipment. So they're on a phone or on an iPad or some other device. And suddenly everything kind of gets changed. And that's something that I'm not sure what control, but those are some of the variables that have to be considered when attending a meeting as well by the individual member. And it's in the training and the time spent with the IT staff and the member, making sure that they're up to par.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think when I was talking about the power outage was really about the parliamentary privilege, and that, I sat through the House a lot of times where people were interrupted in their ability to vote. So how to manage these things that are beyond those.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney.
That is an issue.
It's time for the second round of 5-minute questions, and up first is MP Broussard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Speaker, appreciate you being here, and the clerk as well. And as you know, Speaker, the motion that was introduced yesterday was a rather long one, and we dispensed. And I know that you appreciated that. But there are some challenges with respect to the motion, one in particular that I want to address to Mr. Robert. In the motion adopted in the House yesterday, there's something that's very interesting and quite frankly should be very concerning to all members of Parliament with respect to their privilege, because buried in as a provision in subparagraph 5 of paragraph H, it says that the participation in the virtual QPs we're going to be having will be subject to limits set by House administration. So effectively set by you, Mr. Robert. A majority in the House voted for that. Obviously, we didn't, but a majority did without knowing what those limits might even be. Can you explain, Mr. Robert, just what exactly these limits will be?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Broussard, as the Speaker explained, the resources that we have available to implement a virtual sitting, both for committees and now for the Special Committee on COVID-19, are fairly limited. when the speaker replied to the government House leader as to how we could put in place a full virtual meeting of the House, we indicated that we would not be able to do that much before the middle of May. The House, in its motion yesterday, decided to create a special committee of the on COVID-19 pandemic, which in fact its membership is the entire House. And you're going to be having your first virtual meeting next Tuesday. Under the explanations that we have already provided, we do not believe that we will be in a position to allow a special committee to meet with the entirety of its membership. That is beyond our capacity. And we were trying to signal that, and I suspect that when this motion was drafted, they took into account the warnings that we had raised.
So how many members do you expect to be participating in these virtual QPs? And how will the choice be made in asking questions of the Prime Minister and the ministers? Who will be making that choice as well?
My guess would be that we would be trying to coordinate this as much as possible with the whips, so that there is a comfortable coordination of the membership, so as to satisfy their requirements, given the limitations that we will have in terms of how many. Now, we have had a meeting. We have, I think, in this meeting, we have about 30 participants. We will be able to up that for the meeting next Tuesday, I would suspect, but it will be far short of an entire membership of the House. But we will try to coordinate that with the whips.
How much time have I got, Madam Chair?
Got about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Speaker, a question with respect to an article that appeared in the Hill Times on April 9th, where you were quoted as saying that you were instructed to look into holding virtual sittings. Was that a mischaracterization? Because the speaker is not to be instructed by anybody. So I just want clarification on that, Mr. Speaker.
I was asked to look into it, and that's exactly what we're doing. Yes,
and
it was not instructed. Yes,
you were asked by who?
That was in the letter from the government House leader.
Okay, Mr. Robert, have you had any discussions with the government House leader with respect to virtual sittings? Have you been instructed, asked at any point during this process?
No, but in any sort of conversations that have taken place, the caution that I've already expressed to you about our capacity to provide this service within a timeline that was different from the response that was provided by the speaker to the government House leader has been raised.
Thank you. Now, we've got a very limited time, gentlemen, to deal with this issue. We've been asked to provide a report by May 15th. We've got effectively 5 days. We've extended the hours. We're going to hear from several witnesses. Would you, both of you, on the back end of our mandate, be willing to come back and address any other issues that may come up either from legal, security, procedural, any of those aspects? Would either of you gentlemen be willing to come back at the end of our study to address some of those issues?
I would have no problem with that.
Mr. Brassard, in addition, I would add, I think that we should be taking this experience as the first step in a larger program of determining how we might want to build a capacity in our parliamentary system to allow for such things as virtual sittings to deal with circumstances that may arise unexpectedly where the use of a virtual sitting would be appropriate.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Next up is MP Gerritsen, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'm going to jump right into it because I think I'm at the 5-minute round. So what I would really like to ask questions related to not particularly the 338 MPs, but all of the staff that support us. The reality of the situation is whatever decision we make in terms of bringing people together, at least the 338 of us were part of that decision-making process. Whatever comes out of this, we are imposing upon other other people out there who really don't have a say in whether or not they're going to have to continue social distance in some form or another, or outright abandon it in order to be present on the Hill. So my first question would be, can you clarify, Mr. Speaker, who is responsible for an employee on the Hill? I have 2 employees that work for me in my Hill office. Are these employees of Parliament, or are these employees of a member of Parliament specifically, and whose responsibility is it to ensure their safety?
It is the responsibility of the individual members of Parliament to make sure that their staffs are safe.
So in effect, that my employees are, I am their employer as it relates to responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay. And do you have a sense as to how many employees would be on the Hill at any given time when we're normally sitting outside of this virtual setting?
I'll have to defer to the clerk for that one. I'm not sure if do we have a number?
My guess is that it's roughly 1,000. If it in normal circumstances, about 1,000.
It's
you have 338 members, and they have multiple. They have more than one employee in most instances.
Okay, and the direction. So I know that the speaker said earlier on. He indicated. He said that, or maybe it was through a question. It was asked: is there the opportunity to, is staff being directed to do something on the Hill? So directed not to come to the Hill. Can the House administration direct these staff that are the employees of members of Parliament to not come to the Hill if they wanted to, or is that up to the member of Parliament to do that?
What we've done is we've laid out guidelines for certain buildings that are not essential, and we've asked members of Parliament not to have their staff come in unless they come in through appointments, or make sure that they're covered, just to make sure that everything is sanitary. What we had found was that there was some MPs who had some staff who was coming in, and they would come in for a few hours, and it was spotty. Like, we didn't know where they were. We would try to keep records and then send staff into cleaning staff to make sure that everything was sanitized once it was done, to avoid the spread of germs of the virus. So what's ended up happening is we've asked that certain buildings be shut down, and that center block and only essential buildings be open. The center block being an essential building.
Okay, and in terms of all of the, so I'm talking specifically about staff that are members of Parliament staff, but can you tell us what the direction has been in terms of any other parliamentary staff? Have they been told to stay home? Have they been told to work at home where possible?
Where possible, staff is instructed to work from home. Now, there are staff members who have come in because it is essential that they be on the Hill. One of the prime ones is security and cleaning, and again some of the top administration. And lately, with some of the work that's been being done on the technical side, the IT end of things as well.
So, Mr. Speaker, you're responsible for, with House administration, the staff that are coming that work in West Block and on the Hill, correct?
Yes. Correct.
As their employer, given the information that you have and what has come forward from Health Canada and the various different agencies, would you be concerned about their health and safety if 338 people from across the country started showing up in that building and all of their staff from various different places?
I would have to be yes. I mean, when you start having people from all over coming to one place, yes, they're bringing, we don't know whether it's picked up on the plane or from their own place of residence. Yes, it certainly is a concern that has to be taken into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Gerritsen. Mr. Speaker, are you okay for taking one more question?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you. Actually, it might be two more. Mr.
No problem.
Duncan.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for being here today. I wanted to focus on another aspect we haven't really touched on too much, is around voting and what that might look like. I alluded in your opening comments there, and I appreciate your comments on the difference, or perhaps an easier aspect of doing member statements of SO31s and question periods versus voting. Can I just get some preliminary thoughts of what you're thinking on, and you're coming to talk about phasing some things in. Just some opening comments or general comments on your thoughts or concerns or challenges about voting and what that may look like on the onset, and some timelines on that.
Yeah, voting is something that we are not, I don't see happening in the near future. That's something that requires some technology that personally I'm not comfortable with yet. What we'd have to do is develop a secure systems that guarantees that everyone can vote and everyone can vote securely. We can't have what I do have a concern about is parliamentary privilege, where you have a few speaking for others. And we've seen it in other parliaments around the world, where there's almost a proportional system where one group, one party will vote a certain way, and that represents they have a representative who represents all of their members. And
kind of like a proxy or a pairing type system at a macro level.
I mean, if that's what Parliament decides, but they would have to decide on something like that. That's something that is not in our rules right now, our standing orders, and it's the heart of what our system is, allowing individuals to vote, and at the base of the parliamentary privilege.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I agree on that from a security process. If it's the security and then the process and even the connectivity and timing and how that would work, I think there's certainly a lot of barriers that way. One of the things I say, and it goes back to the difference again between committees sitting like this. This is we're working the kinks out, I think, bit by bit, but there certainly are some challenges as been raised with connectivity. I'm from rural Eastern Ontario, and I don't know if the service is getting better or staying the same, but surviving that way. Just to wonder for general access in terms of access for Canadians. I think more Canadians being home and staying at home are perhaps watching these broadcasts if it's online. Have there been more discussions about whether CPAC would, or an online entity that way through television would be airing these, or the ability to do this? Because I think not only is it important for us to have this access to our committees and amongst each other, but as many ways as possible for Canadians to see what we're discussing in the virtual chamber or in committee. Have you had any comments or thoughts on that?
The proceedings of Parliament are open to all Canadians, and what is fed into CPAC is actually run by our IT department. And the feed that they provide for them, all the work, the heavy lifting, is done by our IT department, and very capable of doing so. Certainly, transparency and openness is something that I believe is very important to all Canadians. So I can see it being something that we want to continue.
Okay, well, and I appreciate that. And one of the other aspects I just wanted to bring up too is about the timeliness of this as well. Are we, when we're back out on this in terms of, I'm looking at light at the end of the tunnel, whenever or wherever that may be, are you looking at timelines or end dates? I know in some of the legislation, the emergency legislation we've passed is sunset clauses on that. Do you want to speak a little bit about your intentions for that flexibility, if it's public health, or if there becomes some ways in the chamber to the comments raised before about the safety of our staff, ourselves as members, and the support staff around there? What guidance are you using for decisions or continual conversations about some sort of physical presence? Just wondering if you can comment on that and what discussions you're having in your group.
That's an evolving discussion that goes on, looking at what Health Canada has to offer, what experts have to offer. We're looking at making the best decisions possible for everyone's safety. As far as looking down the road, this really is uncharted territory, and I wish I could give you a definite date on when all this will stop and go away. It's just continuing. One of the things this is a good opportunity for us to look at what we're doing, our process, our standing orders, and look at special conditions or special, this is an opportunity to make changes so that we can be prepared for future events as they come up. This is obviously not the first time we're going to, or the last time we're going to go through something like this. What I'd encourage the committee is to prepare for different scenarios and look at what the possibilities are down the road, and look at what might be the possible triggers to get those new alternatives in place, so that if we do come across something like this again, they would have, or we would have as a parliament, the opportunity to say, okay, this has just triggered a certain amount of doing things or a certain way of doing things. Let's move in that direction.
Thank you. And the last question, I'm probably getting low on my time, or am I out? It looks like I'm out. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, your mic's not on, I don't think.
Okay. Sorry, next is Mr. Turnbull, please.
Great. Just out of the spirit of collaboration, I'd like to give the last minute of my time to Ms. May, if possible. Is that okay, Madam Chair?
Yes,
thank you very
absolutely.
much. Okay, great. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for being here. I really appreciated your comments this morning. And in particular, I appreciated the comment you made about innovation. I think anytime any institution, especially as large as the House of Commons and the federal government, adopt new technology or any kind of innovation, there's going to be challenges and bumps in the road. And I think I really want to say a hearty thank you to all of the staff at the administration for doing, I think, heroic work in a very short period of time to get these virtual meetings up and running. It's quite a testament to how quickly we're moving to respond to the needs of Canadians. One of the questions that I have, and I'm deeply concerned about the fact that we're still going to have some physical presence in the House, given the risks that my colleague Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor pointed out, which I think are pretty large at this time. I would just ask, if we took the best science and the best possible public health advice, do you think we would actually have any physical sittings right now in Parliament?
I have to base myself on the information that I'm getting now, and the information that I am getting is the least possible contact or physical proximity, the better. Is there an absolute yes or no? I don't believe so, because we do have essential services, and essential services are taking the necessary precautions, whether it's in a hospital, whether it's on certain areas that have been designated, mainly on a provincial level. So to say that is our presence in Ottawa a good thing or not? There are variations there. I don't think there's an absolute yes or no, but just from what is taken into consideration for travel and contact with others, it is something to worry about. If I can touch on something else you mentioned, I touched on extending or looking at different options. I think this is for how we do things in Ottawa. I'd like to raise this as an issue that maybe how we do things and changing our standing orders deserves a more fulsome study, and it's something that maybe I would recommend to the committee that they continue, and once this is over and they've reported, continue looking at different options that would keep Parliament running once if something like this should happen again, or something worse, and look at all the worst case scenarios. I'm sorry for taking some of that time, Mr. Turnbull.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your comments. And I'm also interested in the comments that you made about capacity and understanding. I think we all understand that sort of replicating a full sitting day is a really big task. And certainly we need to take it in bite-sized chunks and sort of gradually work up to it. And I think you've expressed in your comments some concern about capacity and being able to do that. I think, where are the easy places to start? Because it's clear to me that we really do have a duty to protect the health and safety and limit our physical, being in the same physical space. And I would actually say that our work and our role, unlike construction workers, healthcare workers, grocery clerks, and other essential support staff out there, do not require us to be in the same physical space. So I want to ask you, whether you see a good place to start, and what are the bite-sized chunks, and how could we phase this? Do you have any ideas on that, Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, there are limited resources, and that's something that is more of a technical barrier than anything else. At this point, I honestly believe that what we have to do is grow incrementally, starting off with certain areas that we know shouldn't be a problem. Some of them, like either an SO31, where members have statements to make, whether they're questioning each other, like a committee that we have set up for next week, where information sharing is one of the big things. As soon as we get into something a little bit more technical, like voting, we want to make sure that that vote is not interrupted and works out well. So that's where I can see us growing on a gradual basis, and it might be a question that might be best answered by our technical people in the second part of this committee meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now a minute for Ms. May.
Madam Chair, I had my hand raised. Point of order.
Oh, yes, Mr.
How much time did Mr. Turnbull have?
He's had, okay.
I have him over 5 minutes.
I have him at 4. Yeah, it leaves 10 seconds right now.
Thank you.
I was trying to get the speaker to finish off what he was saying.
He's over 5 minutes, so.
No, he's not over 5 minutes. He's under 5 minutes, but it doesn't leave a full minute for Ms. May at this time.
Madam Chair, could I just ask for some leniency, given the fact that I think you were lenient on some of the other speakers as well?
I've given almost everyone, 30 to 40 seconds over in the past rounds, and that's including the Conservatives, including the Bloc, including NDP. And at times I do want to explain also, I try to look for a clean break. Of course, if a question is just about to be asked and their time is already done, I will cut off the question because there's no way we'll have enough time for the response. But if the response is underway and almost completing their thought, then that's where I do tend to give a little bit of leniency so that the witness can continue their thought. But of course, no, I would not allow another question at that point if time is close to being complete. So just to let you know how I try to give flexibility to everyone by a little bit so they can just end off their thought, but not start a new one. Okay, if we could give 1 minute to Ms. May, that would really just be giving her about 30 seconds extra.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, and the Speaker knows, of course, how deeply I take the issue of the privilege of parliamentarians, that we participate equally, all rights being equal. I'm very concerned about our current the agreement voted on yesterday, because obviously people who are under quarantine in their provinces have a hard time participating. My question is, on the connectivity issue, as you're studying it, recognizing that nothing we adopt now is going to be as good as the real thing, but we have a pandemic, so we're prepared to compromise on quality. But for members of Parliament who travel from rural areas to Ottawa, have you considered looking at the trip that each one of us makes to get to the airport, where we then fly to Ottawa, noting that any airport and airport motel will offer connectivity with a lot less travel for any member from a rural area where there are connectivity difficulties? Are you taking that as a possibility in the study?
Everything is taken into consideration. Unfortunately, we do have the standing orders that we have to work with, and those are the rules that we have within the House. If we disregard them, then it's an infringement of our rules within the House. So in order to change those, one of the hard parts is we would have to bring everyone to Ottawa to vote on those changes, and it really does handcuff us and make it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's all the time we've got for that question. Now we do have a 2.5 minute round that would go to the Bloc and the NDP, but given the time restraints that we are under, I oftentimes we're not able to get to those rounds, and I'm wondering if we could start our second panel, hear from the clerk's statement, and then begin our 6-minute rounds. Is everybody okay with me doing that at this time?
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Richards.
Just being aware of where we are in terms of time, and I know that you had sort of set aside an hour for committee business. I'm assuming that that's just to look at the draft work plan. I wouldn't think that would require a full hour. And given where we are with the time, I would suggest that we leave a full hour for this panel so that we can ask questions of the clerk, etc. And the law clerk, of course, being new on the panel now, and just use the remaining time then for the committee business that would need to be transacted with.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that's a great suggestion. I'm just trying to be mindful of the speaker's time because he was only slotted in for the first hour. Does the Bloc or the NDP have any opposition to us starting the second panel with the law clerk and then having all of the rounds in the next hour? Okay. Okay, thank you. So we will have a 10-minute statement by Monsieur Charles Robert. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will be much briefer than 10 minutes, and then I'll be followed by Philippe Dufresne, the law clerk and parliamentary counsel, who will give an explanation of the constitutional issues that might be involved in holding a virtual House of Commons. So as the law clerk, as I said, and I are here to address the constitutional and legal implications of a sitting that includes the remote participation of members or that is entirely virtual. Parliamentary privilege exists to enable Parliament to function effectively without undue impediment. And in Canada, it is enshrined in our Constitution. The rights and immunities associated with parliamentary privilege includes control by the House of Parliament over its debates and proceedings in Parliament, including its day-to-day procedure. La Constitution prévoit un certain nombre d'exigences.
The Constitution provides a number of requirements that the House must follow in determining how to regulate its debates and proceedings. Relevant to this study is Section 48 of the Constitution Act 1867, which specifies that a quorum of 20 members is required in order to constitute a meeting of the House. Section 48, and I quote, is, "The presence of at least 20 members of the House of Commons shall be necessary to constitute a meeting of the House for the exercise of its powers, and for that purpose the Speaker shall be reckoned as a member." As well, Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867 and Sections 17 and 18 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms
interpretation.
Yes, I was just communicating with the clerk.
Sorry, Mr. Robert, but the interpretation is skipping along as you're speaking, and it's very difficult to pick up both.
Maybe we can just pause for a minute while we can figure out the interpretation. And Mr. Robert, if you can perhaps backtrack by about a minute to 30 seconds of your statement, that would be helpful.
Okay, my apologies.
No problem. Just a minute, please. What you were hearing, Mr. Broussard, just for clarification, was static, right, on your end?
That's correct. And the full interpretation, I couldn't pick it up because it was very staticky and intermittent in and out of the words kind of thing. I don't know if anybody else was getting that, but I was.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, might I say as well that as we, before we began the meeting, it was almost like it was the same interpreter that was having the same problem at the time. There was a technical issue that was identified. It was very similar to what we had before the meeting started, as we were setting up.
Stefan, you might want to tell Philippe he's going to have to read much more slowly than I am.
Okay, just thank you, Mr. Broussard, for bringing that up. I'm wondering if you can try going down to where the translation is at the bottom of your screen. It may be clicked on English right now. Wondering if you could switch that to off and then select the language of your choice.
Okay, I just did that, Madam Chair. But I also understand that one of my colleagues was experiencing the same thing, so I would suggest that everybody do that.
Yes, I suggest everyone do that. Yes, Mr. Richards?
I can just add to this. I will point out that I was previously having that issue. I did do that, the muting and unmuting. The issue there is that at some point when and I believe it was Mr. Gerritsen, when he wanted to speak, I was receiving no audio, and then I had to click that off. So just people will want to be aware that they're going to have to continue to click on things to stay with the audio so that you don't lose it in various. So I don't know if that's a problem that we're experiencing with the audio. I suspect it is, because that shouldn't occur, I wouldn't think. So it's something that maybe the technicians will want to be aware of as well, because there's obviously another issue that's developed there. It's one that we can resolve on our own, by clicking, but it probably shouldn't have to happen, right?
Sure, absolutely. And I thank everybody for pointing this out. I think things will run smoothly the more often we do this. And even honestly, even in the committee room, sometimes we do have the translation fail on us and it doesn't come through our earpieces at times. And it happens in the House of Commons as well. So I think we're making progress, and hopefully we'll be getting, things will be smoother and smoother as we go. The technicians have been informed now. I believe a lot of them are tuned in and can hear our discussion. And so we'll try to do the best possible. For the meantime, if you can click and re-click your translation on and off, and that might help resolve the problem. And we'll be mindful and try to stop as soon as I hear some kind of difficulty again. So if we can have Monsieur Robert continue slowly with your remarks. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm on. Let me begin then with the part where I spoke about, in French, la Constitution.
So at the time, I was saying that the Constitution provides Is this one better? The interpreter is trying a different microphone. This is the second microphone, testing. A different microphone. Can you hear me? Keep going, keep talking.
Okay, they're trying to change the translation. They think the problem may be in the translation booth. So they are going to switch out the mic or change location. So we'll just suspend for about a minute until they resolve that. Thanks for bringing it up.
Madam Chair, can we suspend for 5 so that we can take a bit of a break?
Absolutely. So if you can self-time yourself, though, I really would not like the 5 to turn into 10. And that does occur sometimes when we're in the committee room as well. So please, exactly 5 minutes, we will be starting.
Interpretation in English. Testing. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Testing. English interpretation. 1, 2, 3. English interpretation. Testing. 1, 2, 3. English interpretation. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3. English interpretation.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. Do you hear me? Is my mic okay?
Okay.
Is this
We're
okay?
having a problem in all of our English lines right now.
Oh.
We're gonna go fix it. So we'll be a minute. Thank you.
Okay. English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. Testing. How is this? Do you hear me? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Is this okay? Should I continue? Should I stop? I'm going to stop.
Check 1, 2, English. Check 1, 2, English. 1, 2, English. Vérification. Good. On va faire français.
Again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Is it good? What does that mean too? Oh, the other channel?
Can you switch to English, please?
English interpretation. Testing. 1, 2.
Whoops. Oh.
Ok, je vous entends bien. Je vous entends bien. Pouvez-vous changer la langue?
English. This is the English channel, English interpretation. Can you hear me? Great.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Sorry, Monsieur Robert, about all the challenges and having to interrupt your opening statements a few times there. We believe that the problem has been resolved, and so we can continue on from where we've left off. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Alors, pour la troisième fois,
So for the third time, the Constitution provides a number of requirements that the House must follow in determining how to regulate its debates and proceedings. Relevant to this study is Section 48 of the Constitution Act 1867, which specifies that a quorum of 20 members is required in order to constitute a meeting of the House. Section 48 reads as follows. The presence of at least 20 members of the House of Commons shall be necessary to constitute a meeting of the House for the exercise of its powers, and for that purpose the Speaker shall be reckoned as a member. As well, Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867 and Sections 17 and 18 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms mandate that English and French are the official languages of House proceedings and legislation. Philippe will now address these legal and constitutional considerations.
any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if we could hear from the law clerk now.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, for your invitation to appear today in the context of this important study on ways in which members can fulfill their parliamentary duties during the COVID-19 pandemic, including sittings in alternate locations and technical solutions such as a virtual parliament. As a law clerk and parliamentary counsel of the House, I'm pleased to be here today to address the legal and constitutional considerations that arise in this context. I hope that my advice will assist the committee in its work. As noted by the clerk, particularly relevant to this study is Section 48 of the Constitution Act, which specifies that the presence of at least 20 members shall be necessary to constitute a meeting of the House for the exercise of its powers. Mon intervention aujourd'hui portera sur l'article 48 et sur son incidence en ce qui a trait à un Parlement.
My remarks today will focus on Section 48 and its implication for virtual parliament. At the outset, I want to note that Section 48 only applies to meetings of the House for the exercise of its powers. As a result, it does not apply to committees of the House, such as this committee or the new COVID-19 committee. With respect to the application of Section 48 to House proceedings, I will make three general points.
Jurisdiction with respect to its proceedings, which include the standing orders, sessional orders, and speaker's rulings. Consistent with the separation of powers, courts will be very reluctant to get involved with anything relating to parliamentary procedure and practice. Second, while courts have determined that they will not get involved with the process leading to the adoption of legislation, they will be prepared to review enacted legislation to ensure that it is consistent with the Constitution. Third, courts have held that the Constitution is a living tree and must be capable of adapting with the times by way of a process of evolutionary interpretation within the natural limits of the text, which accommodates and addresses the realities of modern life. While the question has not yet been decided by courts, in my view, if the House were to amend its standing orders and adopt a sessional or special order to accept the virtual presence of members for the purpose of quorum, such a procedural decision would be constitutionally valid, as it would fall within the House's exclusive jurisdiction over the management of its internal parliamentary proceedings, and in any event, would meet the requirements of Section 48 under a modern and contextual interpretation of the word presence. Cela dit, si la Chambre...
That being said, should the House wish to remove even the possibility of a legal debate on the matter, the House could decide to hold votes on the adoption of legislation with the physical presence of at least 20 members. Lastly, Parliament could amend Section 48 to indicate that for greater certainty, virtual presence is considered presence for the purpose of Section 48.
Parliamentary privilege, which is the sum of the privileges, immunities, and powers enjoyed by the Senate, the House of Commons, and provincial legislative assemblies, and by each member individually, without which they could not discharge their functions. Courts in Canada and the United Kingdom and Commonwealth have consistently held that parliamentary privilege is part of the law, has constitutional status, and includes control by the Houses of Parliament over debates or proceedings in Parliament, as guaranteed by the Bill of Rights of 1689, including day-to-day procedure in the House. Dans la décision rendue récemment dans l'affaire Mikisew Cree,
in the recent decision of Mikisew Cree First Nation versus Canada, the Supreme Court majority held that the lawmaking process is largely beyond the reach of judicial interference, that it is for Parliament and not the courts to determine whether in a particular case the exercise of the privilege is necessary or appropriate, and that the existence of this privilege generally prevents courts from enforcing procedural constraints on the parliamentary process. As a result, the House's internal procedures and rules, as contained in the standing orders, sessional or special orders, or speaker's rulings, are protected by parliamentary privilege and cannot be questioned by the courts or any place outside of Parliament. While courts will not review parliamentary procedure, they will consider enacted legislation to ensure that it meets the requirements of the Constitution, whether it be the Charter, the division of parties, or matter and form requirements such as the official languages requirements in Section 133, which led to legislation being declared invalid in the Manitoba language reference. In the Mikisew Cree case, one of the Supreme Court justices suggested that Section 48 could be another such provision.
Section 48 would allow the House to accept virtual presence as presence for the purposes of quorum when the House votes on legislation. In my view, a strong argument can be made that the House could do so for the following reasons. It is an accepted principle in Canadian constitutional law that the Constitution should not be viewed as a static document, but as an instrument capable of adapting with the times by way of a process of evolutionary interpretation within the natural limits of the text, which accommodates and addresses the realities of modern life. In other words, as held in the famous Persons case, the provisions of the Constitution are to be interpreted in a manner that is flexible and reflects the contemporary context. They have been compared to a living tree capable of growth and expansion within its natural limits and are not limited to a narrow and technical interpretation or construction. In addition to the living tree approach, the Supreme Court has also underscored that the Constitution must be interpreted in a manner consistent with its internal architecture and the principles that underpin it. Dans le renvoi relatif à la sécession du Québec, la Cour suprême a notamment affirmé que la démocratie est une valeur fondamentale de notre culture juridique et politique, et a ajouté que le principe de la démocratie a toujours inspiré l'aménagement de notre structure constitutionnelle et demeure aujourd'hui une considération interprétative essentielle. Le président y a d'ailleurs fait référence en tant que pierre angulaire de la démocratie. Dans la décision Chagnon, la Cour suprême a rappelé le rôle constitutionnel fondamental des corps législatifs et de leurs membres.
Sorry to interrupt again. Yes, I can see some heads in the committee room. We're not hearing the English translation at this time.
Sorry, the interpreter was on the wrong channel. Sorry.
Perhaps go back to the beginning of the French portion of his remarks that he just started, and that should clear up the problem. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Donc,
so in the secession reference, the Supreme Court noted, in particular, how democracy is a fundamental value in our constitutional law and political culture, and added that the principle of democracy has always informed the design of our constitutional structure and continues to act as an essential interpretive consideration to this day. And the speaker mentioned it today. In the Chagnon decision, the Supreme Court majority reiterated the fundamental constitutional functions of legislative bodies and the important role of parliamentary privilege in our democratic tradition, ensuring that elected representatives have a freedom to vigorously debate laws and to hold the government to account. As a result, In interpreting any proposed measure, courts would consider whether it furthers or hinders the fundamental functions of the House to deliberate, legislate, and hold the government to account. À mon avis, si la Chambre des communes devait modifier son règlement afin de permettre la présence virtuelle des députés, l'article 48 de la loi constitutionnelle de 1968 qui exige la présence de 20 députés sera entièrement respecté. L'article 48 de la loi constitutionnelle de 1967 pourrait être interprété
or teleconference towards quorum. As well, such an interpretation would arguably be consistent with democratic principle and the internal architecture of the Constitution, enabling the legislative branch of government to continue to exercise its fundamental functions in the midst of a pandemic. La façon dont la Chambre calcule le quorum de 20 députés prévu par la Constitution.
The determination of how the House counts a constitutionally mandated presence of 20 members is, in my view, one within the House's authoritatively established parliamentary privilege over debates or proceedings of Parliament, including the day-to-day procedures of the House. Once privilege is established, it is for Parliament, not the courts, to determine whether, in a particular case, the exercise of the privilege is necessary or appropriate. Applying these principles to Section 48 of the Constitutional Act 1867, the courts could ensure that the constitutional mandatory requirement of 20 members being present to constitute the House is respected, while leaving to the exclusive jurisdiction of the House the procedural aspects of quorum, such as nature of the presence of a member, to be counted towards quorum. Under this approach, the standing orders or sessional orders of the House would state expressly that the House of Commons, in the conduct and control of its procedure and proceedings, was put in place and endorsing internal procedures to implement Section 48 of the Constitution Act.
Application of a court not finding a House proceeding to have the mandated quorum via virtual presence would be that what was adopted in the impugned proceeding could be invalidated. To mitigate against this, the House could ensure that 20 members are physically present in the House for any votes on legislation or on substantive motions. As well, Section 48 of the Constitution Act could be amended to state explicitly that virtual presence is present for such purposes. Selon l'ordre de renvoi au comité, le comité doit également examiner la possibilité que des séances se tiennent en différents lieux.
As well, Section 48 of the Constitution Act 1867 could be amended to
the issue of alternate location that, in my view, Section
À mon avis, l'article 16 dit que le siège du Parlement est à Ottawa, mais il n'y a rien qui empêche de siéger.
Again, sorry, I believe the channels have been switched around. So it looks like those in English are hearing it in French and those in French are hearing it in English. So, and it's quite delayed just right now. So if we could just start from just that portion again. I'm sorry to the witness. Sorry, Monsieur Differency, for all of these issues today.
It's not a problem at all. I want to make sure as well that everyone can hear me. So, au sujet de la possibilité pour la
Donc, regarding the House's possibility to sit elsewhere, Section 16 of the Constitution Act 1867 states that the seat of government of Canada shall be Ottawa.
Decide on its own to sit elsewhere in Ottawa or in Canada. In my view, there would be no legal impediment to the House doing so during the pandemic. And we know that the House has sat in an alternate location after the fire of 1916. That said, there are various considerations that must be taken into account should the House decide to sit elsewhere. Les exigences constitutionnelles et juridiques qui régissent la Chambre.
Constitutional and legal requirements governing the proceedings of the House would still apply to the House of Commons. That would meet in an alternate location. The Constitution Act, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Official Languages Act, provide that everyone has the right to use either French or English in any debates or proceedings. Debates and other procedures of Parliament must be simultaneously interpreted. And holding sessions elsewhere. It could be more. It would make it more difficult to have communications between both chambers.
Thank you. At this point, I was going to say for a little bit that since we have the speaking notes, if we could please start with the questioning round. So we'd like to start with Mr. Blake Richards for the first round of 6 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've got several questions, which hopefully we'll have time for. And some may be more appropriate by one of you, some may be more appropriate answered by the other. I'll let you determine between the two of you where that is most appropriately responded to. In regards to starting with parliamentary privilege, there could be a number of areas of concern, and you did address some of those, Mr. Dufresne. But certainly the one that seems to have come up a number of times is the idea of where there's unstable internet connections, where people have poor connections, and whether that would actually enable all members of parliament to be able to participate equally and fully in sittings of a virtual parliament. And I think we've seen enough evidence in committee meetings and otherwise to show reason for concern there. I wonder what your thoughts would be. Probably this is for you, Mr. Dufresne, in terms of the privilege concerns that would exist for MPs if they weren't able to fully participate as a result of those internet connection issues.
Thank you for that question. I think questions of privilege with respect to the members' access, a member's privilege to have unimpeded access and full participation in the proceedings of Parliament. These types of questions are dealt with on a case-by-case basis by the Speaker, by the House, and they consider the circumstances leading to issues when a member has not been able to have access to votes or the House for reasons of physical obstacles. What were those and what steps were taken and so on and so forth. And so it seems that the general principle is steps ought to be taken to ensure the participation, and then it would be up to a case-by-case review of what happened, what were the obstacles, what solutions have been considered and used in the current circumstances. So it's not something you can address, I think, in a hypothetical, other than to say the efforts ought to be made as much as possible in the context to ensure the full participation of all members.
So trying to get a general sense of this, though, are you indicating that you would think, and I mean, I do understand that all the circumstances have to be taken into account, but are you indicating that you would see the possibility of a ruling existing that privilege hasn't in fact been breached if a member is not actually able to participate, just on the basis that efforts were made and reasonable efforts were made to try to enable their participation, but yet if it was to come down to that they were not able to participate because of that internet connection, do you see a scenario where privilege would be seen to not have been breached? Is that a possibility under those circumstances?
I think I would have to say that any situation would have to be considered when it arises on the basis of the facts at issue, and these would be determinations made by the Speaker on a prima facie case of privilege, and ultimately by the House. So it's not something that that I can make a conclusion on in this context.
Well, I would just say for the record and for the benefit of others who are listening, I mean, this is a serious concern that we would not be able to ensure that the privileges, which I would say are pretty significant of all members to be able to participate. There's no certainty here as to whether if someone was not able to participate because of a poor internet connection that we could actually say that this would be considered a breach of privileges. And I think that's something we all need to be really seriously think about before we move ahead. I'll move on though to the practice of catching the Speaker's eye, whether that be the point of order, whether that be simply standing to give remarks in the House. How would that work in, I don't know if who's best to answer this one, or if both of you have comments on this, but on a procedural, basis, how would this practice work? The idea of points of order, and also just the idea of someone standing and looking to catch the speaker's eye in order to be able to speak in the House. How would we deal with those issues?
And I think you're raising actually some tough questions that we will have to consider seriously and try to develop a kind of technology that will better ensure the proper participation of the members in a way that we are accustomed to when we meet in person in the chamber. The points you are raising are excellent from that perspective. Another example that we were considering actually is that the dynamics of question period, whether or not it involves privilege is another issue, would change dramatically, because when you're not speaking, you're on mute. And in question period, the energy that is exchanged with the banter or the heckling, if you like, among the members in response to questions or in response to answers, you would not actually hear in a virtual sitting unless the technology changes from what we have now. So there are, I think this is one of the reasons why in the speaker's presentation, he spoke about the gradual development of our practices so that we can properly accommodate these accustomed practices that we have. At the moment, there are limitations, and it's better that we try to develop this through the virtual meetings of our committees, through the creation of the special committee, as opposed to doing it in the chamber.
Okay, so hopefully we'll have a bit of time for one or two other issues, but like on this specific issue and others that maybe you aren't able to respond as to how we'll deal with those things now, as you've just indicated, this one is a difficult one for you to respond to at this point, but that you're working towards that. Would you be able to come back to us prior to sort of us producing a report as to what your thoughts are on how we would address
just a brief response to that, if you'd be able to come back?
Because obviously we have to be able to be certain of that. And just quickly, if I can, Madam Chair, just to finish the question off, you both yourself and the speaker have kind of alluded to gradually developing this. So are we not here just to discuss the idea of virtual sittings during this current crisis and maybe any crisis that would come in the future? I don't believe we're here to discuss the idea of sort of gradually developing something that would become standard practice of the House. Am I mistaken on that?
No, you're quite correct. That was why I suggested you may want to take the opportunity of the experience you're doing now to consider at some future date whether or not you would want to develop options when we are confronted in the future with circumstances similar to this one. We would be able to slip into it without having to go through the process we're going through now.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. And that's all we have. I've given lots of leeway on that questioning round so that we, that issue is not questioned again. But I do want to remind everybody that please speak slowly. This is a reminder to the witnesses and to the members as well. Some of the problems that we're having with interpretation, not all, but some are also resulting because people are speaking too fastly, and I'll try to slow down as well myself as I say that. Also want to remind people that the view that Parleview has is generally the same view. I did say this at the beginning, that you would see where the speaker is the main focus. So if people are, be mindful that you will probably not be on the screen the way you see it on Zoom on Parleview. It will be just the speaker. And so we do prefer you to keep your cameras on as much as possible so that the technical team knows that there's not a technical difficulty, but that you're still there just like you would be in a committee room. And if you have to walk away or look away for a little bit, that's fine. Just leave your cameras on so that we know that's what you're doing. Okay, the next speaker is Mr. Alghabra, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And let me start off by echoing what many of our colleagues have said and thank everybody on the committee, the support staff, the IT staff. This is unusual. And I don't think we've said it enough how unusual these times are. and how flexible we are compelled to be under these difficult circumstances. And I'm honored to participate in this committee. You know, I just have a few questions. Let me start off by asking Mr. Dufresne, if I were to summarize basically what you said, is that the House has a lot of flexibility in choosing and deciding how to conduct its business, obviously within a framework, but there's a lot of flexibility in how it decides to conduct its business. Is that correct?
Yes.
So if just like we agree to do this committee virtually, we can conduct other parliamentary business virtually or remotely, and we would still, of course, as long as we put an effort into respecting members' privileges and being considerate to how we conduct our business, we can be still compliant with the role of Parliament.
My statement here is really to say that there's strong recognition in the case law about Parliament's privilege, Parliament's autonomy to determine its procedures and its proceedings and the way that it's going to conduct its business. So courts have said that time and time again. There are constitutional provisions that apply, such as Section 48. And so if there is legislation that's adopted by the House, the court may look to that and say, well, was legislation adopted validly? And was there a quorum, or was there some other constitutional provision at play? But in terms of the manner in which the House chooses to comply with that requirement, in my view, there is going to be a lot of leeway because it is how the House decides to manage its internal proceedings. And so, so that's as long as the House is mindful of those constitutional provisions and those requirements, turns its mind to it and adopts proceedings, makes it clear that it's in the conduct of its proceedings and that it's meeting this quorum by recognizing presence, all of those things should lead, in my view, a court to find that this is the exercise of its proceeding. Obviously, the question doesn't arise at all if you have 20 members physically present, and I'm saying that if you don't have that, then there are some other arguments to put forward.
Okay, thank you. You know, a lot of questions that our colleagues have been posing about health and safety of the MPs and their staff. But there's another angle that I want to address or point to, is that we have, as a government, as public health officials, as a society, we have just asked the entire economy to start working from home. Several millions of people have been laid off because of lack of ability to access their work. Businesses have shut down. There's obviously the entire country, and in fact, the entire world knows that we are under extraordinary circumstances. And I think it's really incumbent on us as parliamentarians, not only to think about the health and safety of employees and MPs, but also to follow the advice that we're asking the rest of the country to abide for. We're asking people who just lost their jobs because of these requirements. So it is incumbent on us as political leaders and as politicians to really do our best to abide by those advice, by that advice. And my question to Monsieur Roubert, there's been several questions about MPs' access to internet. Are you aware of any member of Parliament's constituency office that does not have access to internet?
Sure that I have the precise information for that, but I do believe that in the northern regions, there are challenges for some of the MPs.
Challenges meaning they have access to internet, but it's not high speed?
I think, in fact, that would be the correct, that it's not, their access is limited, it's not high speed.
Right. So it'd be interesting to know how many MPs have those challenges, so we can try to figure out if there's a way we can accommodate those. But I think it's fair to say that there's the massive or the overwhelming majority of MPs have access, if not at home, that at their constituency office.
I believe that that's so, but it's also why I think our IT people are trying to reach out to the MPs and see if they can find solutions.
Okay. I don't have any more questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that, Mr. Alghabra. That leaves some time. Would you like to share it with somebody or?
Sure. I don't know if Madam Elizabeth May, she's busy, but
Ms. May, would you like 1 minute?
Yes, I'd be very grateful for that. Thank you
Okay.
very much. I was interested to hear Monsieur Robert comment, and perhaps he can clarify on decorum, and that we might not be able to have the same level of uproar and violation of the standing orders by Zoom that we have in person. And I wanted to ask him to clarify, because given that we have adopted the practice that the party whips, it would, and we're the only, by the way, Westminster parliamentary democracy that does this, the party whips give the speaker the list of who gets to ask the questions. It seems to me that of all of our daily affairs within Parliament, question period might be the easiest to adapt to a Zoom meeting. So I just wanted to ask Monsieur Robert if you could clarify or add to that comment you made.
Well, what I was trying to point out was, based on coming from a question from Mr. Richards, the portion where we traditionally follow how question period works would probably still be followed. And I think you're quite right, Ms. May, it would be easy to identify the rounds, but not necessarily who the minister or the parliamentary secretary answering the question. That would still be a bit of a challenge. But a critical aspect that would really change is that the excitement that is part of our question period now would be quite different in a virtual environment. That was the point I was trying to make.
I'd like it so much better.
That's all the time we've got. Next, we have, we've got Monsieur Terrien.
Alors, merci.
Mr. Terrien. Thank you. Thank you for all your very interesting remarks. So 20 MPs for a quorum. When that's the case, a parliament can work virtually, and you've confirmed that. Am I right? What I'm saying is that courts haven't ruled on this, but I'm giving you my interpretation that based on parliamentary privilege and a broad interpretation versus a narrow interpretation of the Constitution, and given that the House has decided that there's a quorum of 20, in my opinion, it will work. But there has been no ruling on that. But courts could be called on to consider any decision of the House or ruling in the House. Well, where courts are inclined to intervene, and as I said in my remarks, the Supreme Court has said that the legislative process is part of the internal process of the House. But when legislation is adopted, then courts may be called upon to examine the validity of that legislation, in which case they may want to make sure that that legislation was enacted in a way that is consistent. So Section 48 can be interpreted, and the House has a certain amount of flexibility in deciding how it will function. Now, I'm not a legal expert, and I'm a new member, but if we have a 20-member quorum, along with a virtual presence, what can the House do and what can it not do? Nothing prevents the House from making its own decisions. So you're saying anything is possible? Yes. So now the internet access, that was a good question from my colleagues. It may, in fact, end up restricting the participation of some members in the activities of the House. Now, I'd like to talk about security. We need to make sure that those who are voting are the members in question. Is video enough, legally speaking, to be able to affirm that that vote is actually coming from that member? Well, I think that would be part of the processes that the House is going to decide on instituting. Obviously, This is an issue that will have to be considered closely. What's acceptable and what isn't? And is there a mechanism that provides sufficient security so that the House is satisfied that that presence is there? Thank you. So that would have to be looked at. Now I have another question. Please don't be too hard on me. I just want to understand. I heard that on May 8th, there are some things we could do virtually that we can't do now. I heard that somewhere. Can you tell me if something is going to be any different on May 8th as opposed to what we have now in terms of tools or internet or procedures? Well, in my opinion, what we need is enough time to make sure that digital services can communicate with members and can provide to members the information and the tools they need, as well as give them an understanding and training that allows them to use those tools. That's what we're talking about. I see. All right. So I just wanted to make sure what that date was about. Now, with respect to any bills, if we do end up accepting that 20-member quorum, then there's the whole issue of debate. In other words, who's going to speak? Who's going to ask questions? Is it the whip who's going to be responsible for having a list in order to facilitate exchanges and to allow people to follow debates? But then, of course, there are these questions that happen sometimes out of the blue. So I'd like to know if there's still going to be some spontaneity allowed, or are we going to have to decide this all in advance? That so-and-so will be asking a question after a speech. Well, the reality is that it's your duty to determine as a committee to examine all those issues and how you want to deal with them. I see. So that you're giving us a lot of responsibility. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll give Ms. May the rest of my time if she would like that. I'd like her to be able to participate in this.
Back to English. Sorry, I'll switch back to English. I'll go slowly. Thank you. My question is to pick up on this question of connectivity and access for more rural MPs. And I just wanted to go back to the key point that in a pandemic, I've been very concerned some members of Parliament really can't participate without having to self-isolate when they get home. And I'm wondering if you've looked, I was trying to get to this point with the speaker, any MP, it seems to me, can travel within their own province to a place with a very good high-speed line with far less difficulty than traveling all the way to Ottawa during a pandemic. And I wondered if this intermediate step of leaving home or home office to go to another location for a very solid high-speed line is being looked at.
Well, I think that's really, if the decision is to allow the House or its members to connect remotely, I'm not sure that there would be a requirement that you do it at your home or your office. The one matter that would come into play is the issue of multimedia access and security.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we've got. Ms. Blaney for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. Appreciate deeply both of the presentations. I guess I would like to start off by just asking, we have several committees that have now been running for a couple of weeks. What were the most important lessons learned just from doing committee when you look at applying some of those practices to a virtual parliament?
Well, I would guess, Philippe may have something to add, but my guess would really be that this is a learning process. There's we need to develop experience, and we need to actually test the technology to see what works best. That's why I think the IT people are particularly keen to follow these developments and try to build into the system that we have more effective technology that will allow the members to become more comfortable as they use it so that they can perform their duties more than adequately, but properly and with some satisfaction.
Thank you. And as a person who comes from a more rural riding, for sure, it depends on where I am. And I think if we talk about this as a process that we could potentially slide in to if we are required to, if it's a pandemic or something else that's happening. One of the challenges is internet accessibility, and it depends on where I am. And there are multiple airports in my riding, for example, that do not have good access to internet. So I'm just wondering, in this process, will there be an assessment done of which MPs could have problems or concerns with internet accessibility? I mean, it certainly would make my constituents happy to have that officially on the record, because they live with this a lot more frequently than I do, living in one of the bigger communities.
It's my understanding that that's a concern for IT right now.
Okay. All right, and so we'll be able to identify which ridings are having that concern?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and that can come back to the committee?
I suppose once we collected the data, there would be no reason why we couldn't share it.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. The other question that I have is there's multiple platforms in delivering these types of services. I'm just wondering why Zoom?
I think there might be several reasons. Perhaps it's adaptability to security, but the other thing is, for one, it allows for the floor and 2 languages. Since we are obliged to be bilingual, we have to have 3 channels: the English, French, and floor.
Okay, and that was the only person or the only venue that would operate in that way?
Well, I know that there are some that do not. I'm not sure if there are others besides Zoom that provide this capacity or capability.
Thank you so much. So we've heard a lot about constitutional concerns, and the one part that stuck with me is the need for 20 for the quorum sitting in the House. And I'm just wondering, there was discussion that there might be ways to do that electronically or virtually. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what concerns should we be worried about as members around constitutional concerns and what that could look like. Again, I'm going back to that part of having the ability to slide into this if we need to again. I just want to be clear about how easy would that transition be, or what would be the challenges facing members in that area?
I think that's a question really that Philip would probably be better qualified to answer.
Sure. So what I would say is that it's important, if the House decides, if this committee recommends and the House decides to go in that direction of accepting virtual presence for the purposes of quorum, it's really to identify how that's going to be done, how secure that's going to be, make clear that the decision is made on the basis of the constitutional requirement that it is a quorum of 20 and that the House is putting in place mechanisms so that the virtual presence or otherwise will be considered as presence for the purpose of that quorum. And so really making it as part of the House's procedural decisions and how it is implementing the requirement of the Constitution.
And so when we talk about the process of being able to slip into this, because I think one of the things that's been most impactful for me and for my constituents has just been the process of adapting to a very new reality. And a lot of businesses have talked to me about planning ahead for this kind of event to happen again or something like that. So if we're talking about that slipping into this system, I'm just curious, like what would be, and hopefully somebody can answer, but what would be the method? Would we have modified standing orders sort of on the side that we can slip into? How would we make that decision? If we want to, we've heard that, when we change standing orders, we want everybody to agree. So would there have to be a preliminary sort of meeting where all the members could be there? I'm just trying to understand the process.
I think that that's really something that the committee has an opportunity to look at within the narrow frame of your May 15th meeting. That may be a bit difficult, but the experience you're acquiring, even in preparing for this report, may give you some insights as to how this should be handled. Mm-hmm. To date, in the motions that have been adopted by the House, the Speaker consults and the whips of the recognized parties have a role in determining how and when the House should come back. Yeah. That too may provide some kind of a model. It's not impossible to have, as a lay aside, specific standing orders that would apply for a virtual environment that could kick in and everyone would know what those standing orders are and how they would apply as a reserve for when we go into a virtual environment. Otherwise, we stick with the normal method of doing things that we are accustomed to.
Right. Thank you so much.
Monsieur Robert. At this point, I just wanted to check the pulse of the committee of whether you'd want to get into the 5-minute round of questioning. I know there was some desire to continue questioning, but we're only left with 30 minutes for committee business, and we do need to get through our witness list and work plan. Any feedback?
Madam Chair, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. That's okay.
So do I, Madam Chair.
Okay. All right. So we will.
Chance to ask a question.
So we'll carry into the 5-minute round, and that's all we're going to have time for is the 5-minute round, and that may leave us with 15 minutes for committee business. I'm really hoping on some cooperation to get through the committee business as quickly as possible because we don't have a lot of flexibility past 2 o'clock. So please carry on, Monsieur Broussard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I really want to pick up on the theme that Mr. Robert just ended up on. I think we need to step back here and realize that what we are looking at is a temporary measure of a virtual parliament. Now, we can have some foresight, as Mr. Robert said, and what are the mechanisms that kick in or what circumstances kick in on a virtual parliament going forward. But right now, as it stands, we are dealing with this issue in the height of what is a health crisis. And, you know, I'll remind all the committee members as well that there are essential workers that are putting themselves on the front line every single day across this country. There is talk about reopening economies in every single province. There's talk about opening golf courses, for God's sakes. But my question, Mr. Dufresne, is in relation to what you said about the Constitution before, and that is that it is a living tree and that it does adapt to modern time, modern life, you said. How would the courts interpret modern life as it related to the Constitution? Because again, I want to reemphasize that we are in a, by all accounts, a temporary health crisis that will subside at some point, and we're going to get back into modern or normal life. So what would the courts interpret modern life as, and how would that be applied when it comes to changing the Constitution and the requirements of Parliament, as you stated earlier?
Thank you, Mr. Broussard. Well, so in terms of changing the Constitution itself is an option. That is something that could be done, but it requires a decision of Parliament as a whole. So if you change the Constitution, you amend it, and you can say for greater certainty, virtual presence is considered present. So that's one option. The other option in terms of interpretation is to say the Constitution requires presence of 20 members. Can virtual presence be acceptable by the House as presence for those purposes? And under the argument of a living tree, modern interpretation, the argument would be in modern times, teleconference, video conference, these types of tools are used and can be used to indicate one's presence and participation at a meeting. And so while that would not have been acceptable in the initial view of the Constitution, obviously in modern times it can be. The other element that could be relevant is the presence of this emergency health crisis. There is also the point that I made about interpreting the Constitution in a way that makes sense in terms of its internal architecture and the principle of democracy. So is it necessary for democracy to function and for the House to function during a pandemic to have some flexibility about how it operates? That would be something that would be relevant in that discussion.
So what could happen here, Mr. Dufresne, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we could effectively upend 800 years of parliamentary experience if a majority of a minority parliament or a majority government decides that this is the direction that we want to go. So a majority government gets elected, it has the most seats in the House, it decides that it's going to determine, or the potential exists that it could decide how Parliament is to function. does that fall under this category, or if in a minority situation, a majority of the seats, whether using the current example, the Liberals, the Bloc, and the NDP get together and say, this is the way we're going to change it? Isn't that dangerous for our democracy, that type of power exists to change and upend 800 years of parliamentary democracy?
Well, what I can say is it is recognized very much as part of the long-standing legal and constitutional principles that the House is the master of its proceeding. Whether in a minority or majority, the principle is there that the House can make those decisions. In terms of the Constitution itself, it can be amended by the House and Senate and royal assent. Again, majority or minority is not going to be the determining factor. So the question of should it be temporary, should it not be temporary, those are things really for this committee and for the House to determine what is appropriate and what is not.
Right, and I would submit again to the members of the committee that we be looking at this as a temporary measure, as is our mandate, with an eye to the future in the event that these type of circumstances happen again. This is not to undermine 800 years of parliamentary democracy. This is to be able to work through this situation. So I just bring that to the attention of the committee members, and Madam Chair, I cede the floor.
Thank you so much. If we can shave off about 30 seconds on everyone, I think we'll be in good shape. Mr. Gerritsen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Robert, when you were commenting about perhaps a reduced amount of heckling during question period, I couldn't quite discern whether or not you thought that was a good thing or a bad thing. Did you want to clarify on that?
I think I would prefer to avoid answering that question.
Fair enough. On the issue of jurisdictions and voting, and let me take it back for a second. Mr. Broussard just concluded with talking about a parliamentary system that was based on 800, that's 800 years old. My question from a legal or perspective would be, did 800 years ago the system that we have just suddenly appear and we've been using it the exact same way ever since then? Or would you like to comment on that?
Well, the history really has been one of evolution. The very first parliament was in fact only one chamber, largely the House of Lords. Mm-hmm. The House of Commons split off in the 14th century, 13th century? Oh. And then we had an alternative. The Committee of the Whole was developed, I think, in the 17th century. Parliamentary privileges were anchored in Parliament by the end of the 17th century. Ministerial government came into being in the 18th century. The constitutional principle of responsible government came in towards the end of the 18th and was confirmed through actions in the early 19th century.
So your indication here is that things are evolving over time. Should we expect that on day one, when we have our first meeting that is done virtually, that it works seamlessly without error? And if it doesn't meet this incredible threshold that we placed on ourselves, that we should abandon it? Or should should we be approaching it from the same position, that even in a virtual kind of setting, things evolve as we get better at it?
Well, I like the idea that you would expect it, and we would certainly want to provide it. But in fact, there will be glitches that we will try to accommodate to make sure that the system improves and the satisfaction that you feel in the service that we are providing grows.
And if over time we saw, okay, something needs to be changed, just like all other parliamentary practices, would it be appropriate to be amending that stuff as we move forward?
Sure.
And then, my last question goes to, other jurisdictions, and perhaps what you're familiar with talking to clerks from, in other jurisdictions that have a Westminster parliamentary system. Can you give any information, even if it's perhaps anecdotal, about what other jurisdictions using our same parliamentary system are doing during this time?
Well, for example, the National Assembly of Wales has started going into virtual sittings, and they seem to be satisfied with the experience. It's developing quite nicely. today in London, the idea of the hybrid model, having 50 members present and up to 120 members, I think, connected virtually, is being debated. It is expected to be adopted today, and it will be implemented for the very first time tomorrow for Prime Minister's question time.
So we are by no means would be developing, we would not be the first to go down this road.
No, I think we're joining a stream actually of parliaments in various places that are actually trying to address this problem for the fact that all of us are confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic.
And my very last question to Mr. Brassard's point of, a minority or majority or a majority of parliamentarians could arbitrarily change the system. Would it not be equally true that should another parliament be elected down the road, that they could change the system again to completely reverse it? Do we not, is that not entirely plausible as well? It seemed as though it was presented, at least in a way to me, that we would change something after 800 years with absolutely no opportunity to go back. But the truth of the matter is that any parliament could make changes, as we see happen with legislation all the time. Is that not correct?
Largely, yes. I think the real question becomes, what is the impact of reversal?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up is Mr. Tucker.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. Real quickly, first question on the Zoom platform. I understand you said that we could have rolled out virtual parliament next month, mid May, and instead we're rushing ahead with using the current platform for next week. If we waited till next month, could other vendors provide some services to us that would be more secure, or kind of more concerning for me, wouldn't be routed through China? And that's the concern I have with the Zoom platform.
Okay, I will speak based on my limited knowledge. I don't think it's really a question of the platform. I think it's really a question of reaching out to the members and making sure they have the equipment that's necessary for them to actually participate. For example, apparently not all members use P9. And so we have to make sure that members are capable of operating the system, being connected, and being comfortable with participation through these virtual means.
Okay. All right, on more of a legal question then. We're governed somewhat under the British North American Act of 1867. Just quickly, Section 18, the privileges, immunities, and powers to be held, enjoyed, and exercised by the Senate and the House of Commons, and the members therefore respectively shall be in such as from time to time defined by the Act of Parliament of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
This is where it gets important though, but so that any Act of Parliament of Canada defined such as privileges, and this is what we're talking about, immunities and powers shall not confer any privileges, immunities, or powers exceeding those of a passing of such act held, enjoyed, and exercised by the House of Parliament of the United Kingdom of Britain. So I would say that as if we are not to be passed along greater privileges than the House of Commons in United Kingdom, isn't this exactly that? Because they are sending in a skeleton crew to sit in their House of Commons or Westminster, and then have the option for the other members to teleconference in. Our privileges would be greater than theirs, and how would you square that then?
The privilege at issue is the same as the one that was in the UK, which is the control over the proceedings of Parliament. It's the ability of the House to make determinations about how it's going to operate and how its procedures and usages will evolve with time. So in this respect, the privilege is the same one. It's the exercise of it, how it's being exercised, how different assemblies are choosing to adopt different procedures. That doesn't have to be the same. But what is the same is the autonomy for those decisions that will be respected by courts.
But the exercise is different. There is, they meet the threshold of the skeleton crew so that the virtual could take place. Aren't we somewhat still governed and I know we are, in some of the same conveyances that the British House of Commons also is governed by?
My interpretation of privilege is that the House of Commons and the House here in Canada and in the UK have the ability to control their proceedings, their parliamentary proceedings, adopt rules. It doesn't say that Canada House of Commons has to have the same procedural practice and rules than the UK House has. They are independent entities.
So that we can operate differently, but the privileges we can't have greater privileges over a member from United Kingdom, correct? As stated in the British North American Act.
Oh, excuse me. Can you repeat that, please?
As stated in the British North American Act, we are not to have more privileges or greater privileges than the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
That is correct, but privilege also has its origin in the preamble of the Constitution. So Supreme Court has recognized there is the legislative codification of privilege that talks about those privileges that existed in the UK in 1867 and so on. But there is also the inherent privileges from the preamble of the Constitution, and those are based on necessity, what's needed for parliaments and houses to operate. And at the core of that is control over proceedings in Parliament and internal proceedings. That's there's no question about the existence of that privilege and that autonomy for the House to make its own determinations about how it's going to operate within the confines of other provisions of the Constitution.
Thank you for that. Can we move on to Mr. Turnbull? And this is going to be the last round or last questioning by a member. And then we will move on to committee business. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'll try to be quick. Mr. Dufresne, I'm going to just jump right in and ask you a quick question. Based on what you've outlined in your remarks, I interpret it, and I just want to see if I'm correct here. Is there anything preventing us legally or constitutionally from operating virtually at this time?
The only constraint on that is Section 48 of the Constitution that talks about the quorum of 20 members for the exercise of the House's powers. And so the most likely area where that could be raised with courts is the adoption of legislation, but there is significant leeway in terms of parliamentary privilege. And as I've put forward, my interpretation is that that provision could withstand the acceptance by the House of virtual presence, but that's not yet been fully determined in court.
Got it. And you outlined two options by the look of it. One would be to amend Section 48 of the Constitution Act, and the other, I think, which probably is preferred by many for numerous reasons, is to have a separate piece of legislation that's voted on that would, I guess, enshrine an interpretation of presence as virtual presence. Do you see any challenges in moving forward with that?
Well, as I've indicated, I think if you have 20 members physically present in the chamber, there's no question. If the Section 48 of the Constitution is amended, there's no question. If you adopt standing orders or other instruments from the House to say, in the implementation of Section 48, the House is deciding to accept virtual presence, in my view, that should be upheld as a matter of parliamentary privilege and as a legitimate interpretation of Section 48 of the Constitution, but that's not been fully determined yet.
Thank you for the answer. Appreciate that. Last question from me. We've talked about parliamentary privilege and that being a foundation, and it's obviously extremely important to all of us. We place a high value on that. And many of the concerns, I think, outlined as to what the challenges might be with implementing a virtual parliament point to some of the areas where those privileges may be stepped on or infringed upon. I'm just wondering, from my perspective, do infringements on parliamentary privilege not happen all of the time within our normal physical meetings in the House of Commons? And I'm just wondering if you could list a few examples of those, and maybe Mr. Robert, maybe this would be a question more geared towards you. And you're on mute.
Mr. Robert, you're
Yep,
on
sorry.
Okay.
In terms of parliamentary privilege, I think, in fact, they are generally respected. Much may depend on the members' particular views about what is actually privilege and what deserves to be treated that way. That, I think, is where there's a lot of flexibility.
Okay, I guess within the context that we're in, and given the fact that we're certainly would experience some technological challenges, and the issues that people have raised are certainly important to overcome. I guess I'm just wondering whether those in this context would be considered undue impediments to that parliamentary privilege, or whether that context would be taken into consideration when implementing a major shift in our practices like this at this time, which are clearly required due to the health crisis we're in.
I think that that's a very good question, and it speaks to the challenge that we're facing. We want to guarantee our health safety. We are exploring this as an option for how we might behave. Issues of connectivity in such a vast country with 3 time zones creates its own set of challenges, and they have to be met. And I think that's one of the reasons why so far we have talked about a gradual approach. And I think it's also why the speaker may have signaled in his comments that there's a need to be also a bit patient and understanding about how we implement and integrate this technology so that it becomes an element with which we are comfortable. Mr. Brassard rightly points out that the work of this committee really is limited to the circumstances of this pandemic. And you have a reporting date by May 15th. So the issues of privilege may not actually be finally resolved by the time you are able to prepare a report for submission to the House.
Thank you so much. And that ends our time for our witnesses and for the members questioning. I like to thank both our witnesses or all 3 of our witnesses actually, for appearing before committee today. And also thank you very much for offering to appear from time to time and answering the committee's questions, whether it be, verbally or through writing. We will appreciate that help. And now I think we should move on into committee business. We have very little time left. And first of all, we need to formally adopt a witness list, and the members have been provided a consolidated list by party and a second document as well with the list that's been scheduled into a thematic panels, and that is what we had agreed on in our meeting 1 of this issue, that we would group our witnesses thematically. And I think that was a very helpful suggestion because it helped me and the clerk to be able to group some of these witnesses together. So I wanted to see if we have agreement for the most part on the witnesses that we have before us and the working plan that we have.
Madam Chair?
Yes, who is that? Mr. Richards, yes.
Mr. Richards, yeah. A couple of observations, I guess, that I would have on these. First of all, I'm just trying to find my copy of it here. So hang on, just so I can refer to the proper panels here. So is next, let's see, is it Thursday's meeting? Bear with me 1 second while I just take a look here.
No problem. I know there's a lot of papers to look at.
Well, yeah, that it is the meeting for this Thursday that I'm referring to first. I got a couple of
the 23rd. Yep.
I note that we have the first panel. We have 1 witness, and on the second panel we have a panel of 5.
Yeah.
And some fairly significant witnesses. Not that I'm saying the other witness isn't necessarily, but just that we have some pretty significant witnesses all grouped onto 1 panel. I would suggest that maybe what we might want to do is look at shortening up the time for the first panel and lengthening the time for the second panel, maybe an hour for the first and 2 hours for the second, rather than the typical, just because of the size differences, obviously. And if there are questions for the 5 witnesses on the second panel, they'll be shortchanged in terms of the ability to be asked and answered. So that would be one thing I would suggest. The other thing I would note is that we have the House administration folks scheduled in again on the 30th, immediately following another panel. I would suggest, why wouldn't we move those to the 5th, so that it's actually at the very end of the witnesses. And there are a number of witnesses I've noticed that have not, and I guess maybe yourself or the clerk could update us to some degree on maybe some of them have declined, or I don't know. But I know there was a few witnesses that I thought would be, and I know a number of other members felt the same, would be quite valuable. One of those was Audrey O'Brien. Another would be one of the former law clerks, either Rob Walsh or Mr. Manjo. And simply because, obviously we've heard sort of the advice of those in those roles currently. It'd be good to get another perspective. I think particularly in light of the fact that what we heard today was a bit of a, the law clerk gave obviously his opinion, and but then indicated that he thought that maybe others could arrive at a different conclusion, was kind of the impression that I got from his testimony. So it might be interesting to get another perspective. So those would be a couple, and then there was a couple others that I know we were fairly keen on being able to hear from, and that was Citizen Lab at U of T, and then the communications security establishment. So possibly we could squeeze some more witnesses in by moving those officials to the 5th, where it would be probably more appropriate anyway. So those are two observations I have that I hope we can address.
Absolutely, Mr. Richards. Can you point to me which witness you're talking about from U of T?
Yeah, it's Citizen Lab.
Citizen Lab.
I'm just trying to find it on this list for you, but I don't know. I believe it was on our list that we submitted. I'm just trying to find.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to write it down here in my notes.
Yeah, I'm sure it's on there somewhere. I can't locate it at the present time either, but it was on our list, I believe. So,
Madam Chair, it's Justin Vave, the clerk of the committee. The full list with all names of all suggestions that were received by the different parties were on the first document that was provided in the email, the consolidated list. The document, Mr. Richards, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're working off of is the one that breaks some of the witnesses down into panels. And so not all of the witnesses were slotted in to each of the panel sessions for the meetings. It's sort of in the interest of keeping panels at a manageable size for the most part. But absolutely though, from the consolidated list, if there are any other substitutes or changes or additions that any member would like to add to the panel, as long as we're keeping the panels around sort of 4 or 5, maximum 6, that's completely okay.
Well, that was
up to the committee to decide.
Sure, and that was the reason for my suggestion that one of the reasons for my suggestion that we move the administration officials from the second half of the 30th onto the 5th. That way we would have time for another panel, so we could add additional witnesses on the 30th. And
I do see the witness that you're talking about on the witness list, Mr. Richards, Citizen Lab. So I've made a note of that, and we'll do our best to fit them in, and also make some of your changes that you've suggested after we hear from the rest of the committee members. I also wanted to point out.
Can I just?
Sorry. Yeah.
To be clear, the other witnesses that I mentioned, the former clerk and the former law clerks, would be, I think, a priority from my perspective over the latter two. However, that would be good if we could have all. And again, that's why I'm suggesting. I mean, I do see that we have got some fairly large panels. Why I'm suggesting we should allow that second half of the 30th for additional witnesses rather than the House officials, who could come on the 5th, obviously.
No, thank you for that. I have marked all of them off and made note of your suggestion of shifting the dates. I did want to point out one thing that hasn't made it onto these lists yet. Because we are keeping the panels thematic, the health panel, which is the first portion, and we can get back to the suggestion that you've made of the length of that first panel, may have more than just that one witness on it, because we have reached out to health and occupational safety within the House of Commons as well. Considering we've got so many other administrative officials in different categories, it seemed like only appropriate to also bring the administrative officials for health related reasons into that panel as well, so that witness is not by themselves. I was told that I could suggest a witness, and so after discussing it with the clerk, that seemed like an appropriate witness to put into that thematic panel, health and occupational safety for the House administration. So that may be the second witness. And yes, I believe there's a few other people who'd like to speak at this time. Ryan Turnbull, please.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to support the fact that that public health panel, I have several suggestions of names that I'd like to make. One is the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada, Tina Nemcinosik. Oh my gosh, I really did a bad job of pronouncing that last name, so my apologies. Howard Ju, the Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Stephen Lucas, which is the Deputy Minister for Health, and was thinking maybe possibly, if others support this, is having one of the previous chief public health officers. So there's Dr. Gregory Taylor or Dr. David Butler Jones. Those two individuals, maybe one of those two individuals could be considered on that panel. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Blaney.
Thank you. So I just have a couple of questions. First of all, the first couple of panels are 3-hour sessions. So sort of following up on what Mr. Richards was saying is how long are those panels, and are we going to have conversations about how to break them up? I noticed that on April 28th and after, it's only the 2 hours. Just wondering where we are on that. Is that something that we're still in discussions with? Because, you know, the more people we can see, the better with this short timeline that we have. And I also agree that if we could bring in the officials that were with us today on the 5th, that just gives us more time to have the other folks there. So those are just my comments, just wondering very specifically about what the two panels are going to look like in a 3-hour session, and if we have to go down to 2 hours on the 28th, if there's some sort of reason from the House.
Madam Chair,
yes.
It's Justin Vave again. I have some information about that. And really at this point, I don't have confirmation beyond this week that we would have access for 3-hour virtual committee meetings for next week or the subsequent weeks. So as of right now, the default is the 2-hour meetings. House administration is aware we would like to go for 3, and they're still trying to work that out, but I haven't had confirmation of that is yet possible.
Thank you. And Ms. Blaney, the way it is set up right now for the 3-hour meetings, it would be 90-minute panels each. But we're discussing, I guess, that for the first meeting right now. If you'd like to speak, then you can, I just want to remind you, you can raise your hand where you see the participant list. Underneath the participant list or beside your name, you should have an option to have the ability to raise your hand if you'd like to add anything to whether the 90-minute panels. There's been some suggestions that the timing for Thursday's meeting, and I guess that's what I'm immediately concerned about because it's the very next meeting we're going to have right after this one. So I want to be well prepared for that. Should the panels be kept to 90 minutes each, or should there be some adjustment made in terms of the timing for the health panel to be shortened and the subsequent panel to be lengthened? Sorry, Mr. Broussard.
Yeah, I just, Madam Chair, quickly want to make sure that as we approach the end of our meetings, the last meeting, that we do save a time slot for Mr. Robert and the speaker. They indicated today that they would be willing to come back, and I think it's important, given the information that we're going to hear over the next couple of weeks, that they do come back and be able to answer any questions that we might have of them on that information.
Hi, Jeanette, please.
Ruby?
You can hear me? Great. With respect to the time slots for the two panels, since we're going to be adding some more public health officials to that list, and it's not only going to be one speaker there, I truly believe that we should probably keep our hour and a half per panel, as I think there's going to be a lot of good discussions and a lot of questions that we're going to have to ask those experts as well.
Madam Chair, may I just interrupt? It's Justin Vave again.
Yes, please.
So Mr. Turnbull, if you can pass on those additional new names to us, which we weren't aware of. The meeting that we're talking about is 48 hours from now, or even a bit less than that. There may be some significant difficulties in trying to secure those people for that first panel on Thursday beyond the witnesses we have already secured. The chair has mentioned that health and safety officials from the House of Commons could be made available for that meeting, and that is something that they have indicated to me. So we could add theoretically those additional people for Thursday. Many additional other people other than that, since no outreach at all has been made towards them, we can make best efforts, but may be difficult to secure in a very short period of time before the next meeting.
Okay, thank you, Justin. We really appreciate that feedback. So we will do the best job possible to try to have a balanced panel. But it may be, as we see right now, 2 witnesses on the first panel and 4 to 5 on the second panel for 90 minutes each. That's where we stand right now. And the rest of the work plan, I've taken note of both Ms. Blaney and Mr. Richards' comments about having the clerks back and the witnesses suggested for the 5th, and so we'll arrange that accordingly, and Citizens Lab, and of course O'Brien and the former law clerk as well, to try to adjust that somewhere.
So last point from the clerk, Madam Chair, to confirm one last time, panel 1 for April 23rd, we'd be talking about public health. Panel 2, we'd be talking about legal, constitutional, procedural for April 23rd. And then on April 28th, we would be looking at a panel with the theme of internet connection, challenges, internet security. Panel 2 on April 28th would then be video conferencing platforms and feasibility. And then on April 30th, we would be able to look at other jurisdictions. And if there is necessity to add extra panelists, for example, of trying to secure additional former clerks of the House and former law clerks, we could possibly slot them in on that date. And then May 5th would be reserved for House of Commons officials returning. So for example, the Speaker, the clerk, and other House administration officials more from an IT perspective. Is that everybody's understanding?
Mr. Richards, do you have any feedback on that?
Sorry. Yeah, just wanted to clarify, one thought on the Thursday. If we end up only having 1 or 2 for that first panel, I still would argue that we should probably, given that there's going to be 5 on the second panel, that we should still look at 1 hour versus 2 hours, just because of the size of the panels. Now, if you end up having 4 or 5 witnesses in the first panel, well, then I could understand that leaving it as is would make sense. But otherwise, I would still argue that we would want to shorten it if we were going to have more than twice as many witnesses on the second panel. And just, can you just repeat the plan for the 30th and the 5th then again? And I'm not sure I quite caught it all.
Justin, could you repeat that, please?
For the 30th, we would have for the foreign jurisdictions. So the suggestions that were made about the UK Parliament, Scottish Parliament, etc. And then we could also look to supplement the second panel for that meeting with some of the additional former clerks of the House, former law clerks that weren't able to fit into the second panel for April 23rd, because the second panel for April 23rd is already up to 5 people.
Okay, no, having outside of the one clarification I just made, then I would, it sounds good to me.
Okay, Ms. Blaney.
I'm not mastering the unmute as well as I would like to. I'm okay with that, but I just want to know, let everyone know that I have had word from some of my team that Parlview is just audio. There's no video. So I just wanted to bring that to the attention and find out when that's going to be fixed. But otherwise, I appreciate very much the clerk's update on the schedule. I agree that if there's a smaller number and a much larger number on Thursday to sort of maybe have the time, have some flexibility in that area, because we want to get those good questions asked, and a smaller group doesn't need to talk as long. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney. And you can also get into, you can also use your space bar to unmute if it is for a short intervention. So just hold down your space bar, and that makes the process a lot quicker than having to click unmute by moving your mouse around. So Mr. Gerritsen, you're next.
It's like using a walkie-talkie just while you're holding it.
Yes, it's exactly like a walkie-talkie. And that was in the instructions at the beginning of the meeting today.
I was just going to say that my, when we talk about the number of people that are on each panel, I think we should be focusing on the subject matter of the panel as opposed to numbers of people and distributing numbers of people by a panel. So if one panel is on one issue, we should focus on putting the people that are relevant to that panel as opposed to just trying to split it up based purely on numbers. I was going to throw that out there, which is what I think we're doing, but I think it's important to do that.
Okay, thank you. I think we've gotten good feedback from everybody, and it seems to we all seem to be on the same page and have a good understanding of what the study is going to look like and the number of witnesses we're going to have. And I also have appreciated your feedback, and we're going to try to make the adjustments that were spoken about today as much as possible. Anything else that you would like to ask, Justin?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Madam
All right.
Chair, I
Well,
have one.
yeah.
Sorry,
Yes, Mr. Turnbull.
Sorry to prematurely or prevent the end of our meeting here. I know that we got an email earlier, I believe in the week, that listed, I think it was 4 individuals that that represented different technological solutions. And I don't see them. Maybe I'm missing it. So my apologies if I am. If this is my mistake, I apologize. But just to clarify, are they on the list? I'm looking at panel 2 on April 28th, and I don't see them included there. And I think that that's where they fit, but I'm also not 100% sure whether that's where they are intended to be. So there was 4 individuals sent. I think it was to everybody. Yes, it was, and they seem like good suggestions, but they're not on in the work plan.
Okay, if you take a look at, do you have the consolidated list in front of you as well? Maybe you can point them out there to me by name, or was it?
I have the names here.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's Peter Rothstein, Matthew Schrader, and there's a U.S. Congressman, Jamie Raskin, and Michael Doucette, I believe.
Madam Chair, it's Justin Vave calling in. I could provide some information about that.
Yeah, I don't have them on the consolidated list.
What's on the consolidated list are the suggestions that were provided by the members of the committee. At every study, it does occur that members of the public also suggest themselves to be called as witnesses for the committee. So the email that Mr. Turnbull is referring to, which was distributed to the full committee, was distributed to the full members of the committee. The consolidated witness list that we're talking about is very much the consolidated witness list of the members of this committee who proactively provided me names by the deadline last Friday.
Correct. There have been people proactively reaching out, and also there was one PR firm that was also making suggestions, and we sent that out to everybody, and so that everybody could be aware of what suggestions were coming to us, just to be transparent about what we were seeing.
Madam Chair, can I just ask clarification then?
Yep.
So if I want to suggest that some of these individuals be included in that panel, should I just send an email to the clerk? Does that make sense? Or do we need to agree here?
No, I mean, everyone had submitted their witnesses in themselves. We didn't fully, vet each other's witnesses in that way. So I don't think there needs to be full agreement in that sense. The clerk can correct me if I'm wrong. However, we do have quite full panels. So that's the only thing I would warn about, is that if anything is suggested, it should be it should fit well with the theme of that panel that day, and perhaps in the interest of things going smoothly, I think keeping it to at least 5 as the maximum number would be preferred.
Fair. So that panel, I think, has 4 currently. And I know that some of the individuals were representatives of other virtual platforms that I think we might want to consider. So Adobe, and I think the other one listed here is called Markup. And I don't know the all the ins and outs of those platforms, but I think it would be useful to potentially hear from those options as potential solutions.
Okay. Yes. Please send your, I guess, top choice over, and we'll try to fit it where there's space in the panel that you've just mentioned.
Madam Chair, just on that point, I mean, I understand that there has been, I think it was a lobbyist that sent over some suggestions of people who would like to hawk their products. And that, I mean, I do see Mr. Turnbull is not incorrect. There are a couple of others that look to be doing the same that are already existing on the witness list. If they can't all be accommodated, perhaps it could be suggested to them that they simply send their, a brief that would give their pitch as to why their product would be useful. That could be another alternative.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, and I definitely think that will allow any witness, and maybe we can have some feedback from the clerk. In previous committees and studies, we've allowed most witnesses to be able to submit in writing if they cannot appear, or if we can accommodate them. Justin, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, that's I can confirm. Anybody can submit a written brief, a submission to the committee. So any potential witness that cannot be accommodated as a witness before the committee always does have that option to submit a brief or a submission to the committee to acquaint the committee with whatever thoughts he or she may have on the study that's currently before the committee.
Okay, excellent. If there's no other interventions at this time, I believe we can call this meeting to an end. Thank you so much for participating today and for all your great questions. Take care. See you Thursday.
Great job, Madam Chair.